Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get this meeting started. Welcome to the Washington State Autonomous Vehicle Work Group Executive Committee meeting for August 22nd, 2023. I'm Jim Restucci, Vice Chair of the State Transportation Commission and Chair of the work group. Can we go ahead and do the roll call, please?
Yep, let's get started. Okay, so Jim, you're here. Shiv Batra.
Shiv is excused today.
Okay. Senator Joe Nguyen. Senator Curtis King. Senator Ann Rivers. Senator Claudia Kaufman. Representative Shelley Kloba.
Present.
Great. Representative Mary Dye. Representative David Hackney. Representative Leonard Christian.
Present.
Scott McCoy, representing Chief John Baptiste.
Present.
David Forte, representing Mike Friedler.
I'm here.
Thank you. Marcus Glassberg. Daniela Bremer, representing Roger Millar. Debbie Driver. Joel Sachs.
Allison Drake attending on behalf of Joel Sachs.
Thank you. Caitlin Jekyll, representing Candy Peak.
Present.
Laura Johnson. Pam Cook, representing Shelley Baldwin. Zach Hudgens.
Actually, Shelley's here today.
Oh, okay. Shelley's here. Then we have Zach Hudgens, representing Bill Kehoe.
I'm here. Bill Kehoe is also here.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Yinhai Wang. Justin Layton.
Oh, here. I just put in panelists.
I saw Justin. Thank you.
Bruce Agnew.
Here.
Thank you. Greg Spots. Kurt Augustine.
Present.
Thank you. Brenda Weiss.
Here.
Thank you. Todd O'Brien.
Here.
Fernando Mejia Ledesma. Brian Mistily. Melanie McGillian.
Melanie McLennan. Good morning.
Good morning. Bryce Yaden.
I'm here. Thanks.
Thank you. Ariel Wolf.
David Benelli for Ariel Wolf. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Gordon.
Here.
Thank you. Aiden Ali Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Anna Zebarts.
Good morning.
Good morning. Did I miss anyone? Okay, Chair, we have 20 out of 35 representatives present today.
Thank you so much. I believe we do have a quorum, so we will go ahead and continue with business. And item number 2, industry safety update. We will be hearing from Sam Wempe, Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at Motional, and Ali Sullivan, Head of State Policy, Political Strategy, Senior Manager, State Policy and Government Affairs at Waymo. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. I'll just pull up. Thank you. I have some slides to share if you don't mind. Thank you very much. Okay, good morning. So I had the pleasure of speaking to this group back in 2021. So I'm very happy to be here again and speak with you all. So we're Motional. We envision a world that is safe, reliable, and has accessible access to transportation. While the name may be new, our legacy in this space stretches back decades, born from the brains of MIT and Carnegie Mellon University professors. Now we're a joint venture between Hyundai Motor Group, the global automotive leader, and Aptiv, which is a pioneer in tier 1 automotive supplies. Our focus is on level 4 driverless vehicles, meaning passengers are not required to be in the loop at all for the purposes of riding in the vehicle, and that these are used in ride-hail applications. So we're focused on building vehicles that are not for private ownership, but are going to be used in fleet applications. We utilize a fully FMVSS certified battery electric Hyundai Ioniq 5. You've probably seen some of the consumer models around the streets of Seattle or elsewhere in Washington state. So a little bit about Motional, for those of you that are new to the organization. Our leadership team started off participating in the DARPA Grand Challenge in the early 2000s, and they took those learnings and spun it off into an organization called Nutonomy that came out of MIT in 2013. They worked on kind of some early versions of the technology, did some early cross-country testing, and then in 2017, the startup Nutonomy, where I first began, was acquired by Aptiv. Later in 2018, we signed a partnership with Lyft to bring our autonomous vehicles to the Lyft network in Las Vegas, where we've continued to test our vehicles on the Las Vegas Strip on that network. And then in 2020, Aptiv signed a partnership with Hyundai, creating Motional as a joint venture. So it spun out of Aptiv into its own independent organization that is 50% owned by both Hyundai and Aptiv. In 2021, we began our first tests of fully driverless vehicles in Las Vegas and began transitioning to the all-electric platform that I showed earlier. In 2022, we began a partnership with Uber so that now our vehicles are available on both of those primary ride-hail networks. So they're on Uber and Lyft. And they are also delivering meals on the Uber Eats platform in Santa Monica. So that allows, I'll talk a little bit about both of those partnerships later on. In 2023, we expanded our service to all hours in Las Vegas, as well as the different restaurants we're operating with Uber Eats. And we announced our second commercial market as Los Angeles. For our global footprint, we have an office in Seoul, and then we also are testing vehicles in Singapore. That's really useful for us because the vehicles in Singapore are on the other side of the road, and it also operate in tropical climates with downpours that, I live in Seattle. I know we get some downpours here, but let me tell you, the tropical downpours at the equator are something else. So this gives us some additional experience to help generalize our technology. We are also testing on the roads in Boston, which is our global headquarters, in Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, I mentioned, and in the Santa Monica area of Los Angeles. We do have a satellite office in Seoul, as well as elsewhere in the Silicon Valley. So I mentioned a little bit that we're focused on ride-hail. I think the partnerships we have really speak volumes. These are industry-leading collaborations with the two largest ride-hail companies in the United States to serve the Las Vegas area and eventually Los Angeles before we expand elsewhere. We've been working with at least Uber for 5+ years. We've given over 130,000 rides to members of the public in our autonomous vehicles. Most of these are paid rides that just anyone who is in Las Vegas who opens up the Lyft or Uber app can opt into our service and be matched with one of our vehicles and has an opportunity to ride in one of them. We think that's Las Vegas is a really important place for this to happen because you have people visiting from all over the United States and the world that are able to experience this technology, learn about it, and then go home and talk to their friends and family. So in terms of a public education campaign, we couldn't think of a better place to be testing our platform. The Uber Eats platform is really important here as well because it allows our vehicles to be utilized throughout the day. You know, you've got the typical peaks and valleys of passenger service demand that happen with typical ride hail. And then just off-centered from that is the food delivery times. So our vehicles are picking up passengers, dropping them off, grabbing some food from someone, and dropping that off at the destination before going back to picking up passengers again. We've learned a lot with both of those partnerships, and we look forward to expanding it across Los Angeles and then to other cities in the United States after that. Okay. Now, the very first point up here is that our vehicle is a fully FMVSS certified vehicle. I just want to take a minute or two to really put a finer point on what that means. You may hear from others, and you may have heard from others in the past that we're in need of more stringent standards, or that NHTSA is not involved in the development of autonomous vehicles. I just want to say that nothing could be further from the truth here. Our vehicles are built to the highest standards of federal motor vehicle safety standards, and they're certified as such. They've gone through rigorous testing here in the United States, as well as in the manufacturing facility that we use in Korea. And all of our vehicles come off the factory floor, with all the sensors on them, with the autonomous system loaded, and having completed all of those safety certifications. And throughout our development process, NHTSA has been involved at every step of the way. As we keep them abreast of every time we add new operating areas to where we begin to test. They signed off on our driverless testing when we first began doing that. And all of this has been done while staying within the self-certification approach that the US automotive industry has been taking from the very beginning, and has fostered the vibrant industry that we have today. We also pride ourselves on transparency. So we've published a number of white papers. We collaborated with a number of other OEMs on a safety first for automated driving that was released a few years ago. And then we followed that up with our voluntary safety self-assessment in 2022. So any of you, if you're interested, can go through that document that lays out in detail our approach to safety. I will also note that we've collaborated very closely with TÜV-SÜD, which is a engineering, auditing, and safety company. They've been participants in many of our engineering meetings. They've gone through all of our documentation, and finished their audit to be able to say that all of the safety systems that we say we are using, we are indeed using them, and they've signed off on our driverless testing as well. So I know we've got a number of pieces to get through this morning, and so I'll stop here. I think questions are coming after Aidan's presentation. Is that correct?
Correct. That is correct. We'll take questions after Aidan.
Okay, very good. Well, that wraps up my piece, and I'll pass it over to you, Aidan.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Sam. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you again. Like Sam, I think the last time I had an opportunity to present at the board meeting was probably about a year ago. And so in that time, we've, of course, had quite a lot of updates and developments for the company, which I'm going to discuss a little bit with you all. And then I wanted to switch over to some specific research we've done on the safety topic regarding our operations and what we've actually seen on public roads. So I believe I should be able to share screen, and let me pull up my presentation. See if that, no, I want this one. And let's see. Can you see my screen right now?
It's loading and it just appeared. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, so with the screens, I can't see you all, but I can see my presentation. So we'll start off, just as I mentioned, a little bit of updates and background on the company. As I'm sure most of you are familiar with, Waymo, we started out as the Google self-driving car project back in 2009. For folks that might have spent some time in the Bay Area in those early days, you might have seen some of these funny looking cars driving around the Bay Area. I remember growing up here, I would see them driving around, the Toyota Prius as well as the Lexus RX vehicles. We began developing all of our own hardware and software systems in 2011. And then in 2013, we realized that indeed there was an opportunity within the space. And so we decided to focus, stepped away from driver assistance technologies and focus fully on autonomous level 4, fully autonomous driving operations. The bottom vehicle that you'll see there, the Firefly vehicle, was actually our first purpose-built vehicle. And that vehicle operated on public roads. It was a small fleet of vehicles that we built by hand without any driver inputs. It was at this point we realized that indeed the driving technologies could and did operate quite well, and there was an opportunity there. We also realized that, well, we're probably not the best company to build vehicles, and so we decided to leave the vehicle building to OEM manufacturers and focus entirely on the ADS systems that go into and onto the vehicles that we operate. In 2020, the next sort of huge milestone for us, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, we launched the world's first fully autonomous public service in Phoenix. It is on public roads. As I like to say to folks when I meet with them, they'll often say, well, when am I going to be able to take a ride in one of your cars? And I say, if you fly to the airport in Phoenix, download the app, I'm ready to take your money because it's on public roads and it's fully commercialized. And we've been operating now for close to 3.5 years in Phoenix, in the Phoenix region. We started in a very small territory. It's continued to grow. And as of this month, we're now serving about 250 square miles of a service area. That includes all of Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe, Chandler. So it's basically just the entire Phoenix metro area we're serving, as well as from Sky Harbor Airport. And so that's also a huge milestone for us, the first fully autonomous operations to be serving an airport. And as I mentioned, you can land at the airport and a car will pick you up without anyone in the front seat. You've probably heard a lot of news about San Francisco. We started our fully autonomous operations under testing in March of 2022. And just about a year and a half later, as of yesterday, we started charging for our fully autonomous rides in San Francisco. So that was a huge milestone for us. There was a lot of news around the permitting process in San Francisco. For us, we were able to secure our final permit from the California Public Utilities Commission just a couple weeks ago. That allows us to charge for rides. Up until this point, we'd been fully authorized to operate vehicles without any limit on the number of vehicles or the day, time, anything of that sort, by the Department of Motor Vehicles. So the vehicles were fully certified to safely operate in San Francisco. And then the Public Utilities Commission had authorized a testing permit for us. And so there was a lot of news around what was going on in San Francisco over the last couple of weeks. What I think is important to note, though, is that really the only thing that was being decided, it wasn't a decision about the safety of the vehicles, the number of vehicles, whether or not they should operate in San Francisco. Ultimately, the only thing that was being decided was whether or not we could commercialize, whether or not I could charge for the ride in San Francisco. Everything else had already been permitted for over a year. We're, of course, very excited to be able to charge for rides because can't run a business without making money. And so we're looking forward to being able to serve the San Francisco market. And we had, I believe, close to 100,000 folks that signed up on our wait list to utilize the service in San Francisco once it opened up. Now, is every single one of those individuals going to be user? Who knows? What I do think it highlights is that there's a strong demand on the public side for these services, for services that I'm going to provide, for services that Sam's going to provide, that all companies are going to provide, right? And I think that's the important piece here, is that on the consumer side of things, there's large demand for the technology that we're trying to bring to market. The next market for us, our third market, is Los Angeles. And we started operating in Los Angeles at the beginning of this year. And it's now, 8 months in, and we are already doing fully driverless testing operations throughout the region in Los Angeles. I was in Los Angeles a couple times last month. I actually had the opportunity to take governor, one of the governors, sitting governor, for a ride in our car. He got out of the vehicle after his ride, and the first thing he said, and I have it on video, was incredible. Those are the first words he said. And so again, being able to showcase the technology out on public roads in a really dynamic market, a really dynamic environment like Los Angeles, I think really shows and speaks to the technological prowess that we have and that we're able to bring to market here. We're looking forward to commercializing the rides in Los Angeles once we have our final commercial permit from the Public Utilities Commission in California. As you might know, there's sort of multiple levels of jurisdiction in California, one of which is the Department of Motor Vehicles, the other being the Public Utilities Commission. And so you have to go through sort of duplicative permitting processes. And then the exciting news that we had just about 2 weeks ago was that Austin, Texas is going to be our 4th commercial market. We are really excited about being able to bring our service to Texas. We've been doing testing work there since the beginning of the year, and the regulatory environment in Texas is just so welcoming, so ripe for our operations that we basically decided to shift away from looking at expanding in California and focusing on Texas. And so we plan to have vehicles starting to operate in the Austin market by the end of this fall, and then looking to be doing fully driverless rides on the commercial side by the beginning of next year. So what you're seeing is that as we continue to add additional consumer markets, we're able to go from testing to driverless to fully commercial deployment in a much faster time. And that, I think, again, speaks to the abilities of both the Waymo Driver as well as the learnings that we're able to bring to market. Everything I've learned in Phoenix and in San Francisco and Los Angeles, I'm able to bring to market in Austin and my 5th city, et cetera. And so that's, I think, one of the benefits of the technology is this, the ability to speed to market as you add additional consumer geographies. So one thing that I wanted to note, and I think since the last time we spoke, we have basically transitioned our fleet of vehicles away from sort of a mixed fleet to a fully battery electric zero emission fleet of Jaguar I-PACE vehicles. We are really excited about this. We were able to make this transition with the newest version of our ADS system, the 5th generation of the Waymo Driver. The Jaguar I-PACE vehicle that you see here is operating in Phoenix and San Francisco, Los Angeles. It will also be in Austin. We have retired the fleet of Chrysler Pacifica minivans that we were operating in Arizona for a couple of reasons. One being that was earlier version of our ADS systems, but the second being that from a sustainability standpoint, we have a much stronger opportunity operating a fully electric fleet versus a hybrid fleet. And so we're excited to have that fleet operating, and we'll continue. Even our next generation vehicle is going to be battery electric. So I think you'll see that pretty much all companies, I don't think there's any company within the AV space is operating gas powered vehicles. And so as you're thinking about, well, what are the benefits of these technologies? Being able to bring shared electric mobility to folks that might otherwise not be able to purchase vehicles themselves is a really unique opportunity, and from an environmental and sustainability standpoint provides a great opportunity for states like Washington to bring these benefits. Again, what you see on the vehicle here, I just thought this was really cool schematic because folks will often ask about sort of how the vehicle operates. And I'm sure, Sam, your car is very similar. We have duplicative systems. And so we have radar, LiDAR, cameras, microphones on the car. Just to give you an example, there are 29 cameras on the car. And so as you think about safety and you think about a human-driven vehicle versus my Waymo vehicle, when I'm driving my car, I have arguably, well, 2 cameras. I have 2 eyeballs, and that's all I'm seeing going forward. I don't see that great at night. I don't see that great in fog, and I can't see that far. The Waymo Driver, having just the cameras, for example, 29 cameras, I'm able to see 360 degrees around the car at all times. I have cameras on the front edges of the bumpers, for example, and so that allows me to see further around corners than a human could be if they're sitting 6 feet back from the edge of the car. The duplicative systems, the radar and the LiDAR, allow the car to see at night, in fog, around corners. All of that basically builds a 3D contextual map of what is happening in real time, and the car can see up to 300 yards in every direction. So as you think about, well, what's the safety benefit of an AV versus a human-driven car? Just on the merits of the technology alone, the vision system is far superior to a human-driven car. And so as you think about, well, what does it mean in the real world? And as we've driven these cars out, what have we seen on the safety front, which is what I wanted to talk about here. We published at the beginning of the year a comprehensive safety report on what we saw over 1 million miles of fully autonomous driving. And so while we've done over 20 million miles of driving, what we mean specifically is the miles that we've driven commercially without anyone in the front seat of the car. And so this is really sort of what you would see if we were able to bring the technology to Washington. What would that experience look like? And I think the safety metrics really speak for themselves. So what we saw over those 1,000,000 miles, just to give you a sense what that meant, it was really over 80 years of driving for that average human driver. And so a robust amount of experience. The paper was published. I can share it on with the group. It's online for anyone to look at. And really the goal was to take a look at the experience and say, can we trust this? Are we seeing benefits from a safety standpoint, as well as providing as much possible transparency across the industry and with our governmental partners? That was the goal of this paper. Now, what did we observe? I think this is actually really fascinating. First off, the most important thing, no injuries were reported over that 1,000,000 miles, which is just phenomenal. Out of those 1,000,000 miles, we had 18 minor contact events. And so as you think about, well, what are those events? What do they look like? It's really interesting because as you think about the vehicle behavior that's autonomous versus a human-driven car, well, our car stops behind the limit line at a stop sign, for example, right? It doesn't roll through the stop sign. And so what we find is that in many cases, folks will rear end us because they assume that our car is going to, for example, drive through a stop sign. Out of all of the 18 incidents, human-driven behavior and violation of road rules were the cause of those accidents. And so again, as you think about, well, what causes the accidents with our car? Well, it's other human drivers. And then I think it's also important to note that none of the events included anyone out on the street. So it didn't include anyone on a bike, anyone in a stroller, anyone walking, anything of that sort. What we're seeing based on this experience is that the technology really has the benefit to reduce safety concerns out on public streets, to improve road safety for both vulnerable road users as well as other human-driven cars, and to reduce the amount of deaths that we're seeing out on public roads. So as you think about that safety piece, it really is twofold, right? And so the vehicle can provide a safer environment for VRUs, for folks that are outside of the car, at stop signs, at crosswalks, but it also provides a safer experience for folks that are inside the vehicle, for our passengers, as well as for folks that are in other cars. And so that's, I think, a very important distinction to note, that it's not just about the person in the Waymo car. It's really about everyone within that dynamic road environment will benefit from the safety experience that we're seeing out on public roads today, and that we'll continue to see as we bring our technology to market. So I know we are also tight on time, and we want to leave a couple minutes for some questions, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions, but really appreciate the opportunity. And as we continue to wrap up the work of the task force, we are very hopeful that we'll be able to advance technologies here in Washington as much as is possible. And I think Sam and I would both be eager to look at opportunities to really commercialize AVs in Washington State going forward, and love to continue to work with all of you on that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Questions or comments for our speakers? Yes, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Sam and Aidan. A question about your regulatory environments that you operate in, comparing Texas and California, Arizona, and Nevada. Which regulatory system promotes innovation while at the same time ensuring safety? What's your practical experience in those states, and what lessons are there for Washington State?
And Sam, maybe you can speak to Nevada. There's one point I wanted to make here, and Bruce, I appreciate the question. Thank you very much. As we sort of look at the geographies that we're operating in, I think, as you mentioned, it's very important to balance safety needs as well as sort of commercial opportunity and stimulating the growth of these types of technologies. What we've seen in California, I have now 10 permits that I've had to get from multiple agencies in order to commercially operate in San Francisco. That process has taken, I think close to 6 years, just a permitting process. And so as you think about, well, what's the right approach here? I would argue that does not stimulate the growth of business in your state. And does it provide any additional safety benefits? Not necessarily, as I look at compared to Arizona or Texas. Part of the reason, one of the main reasons why I mentioned Austin as our next market, is because California, frankly, has created an environment that is not welcoming to business growth. And it's really untenable for me to grow my business here, which is why I've shifted my focus to Texas. And that's why Austin is my next market, and I'm not going to continue to grow the business here in California because I can't. It's just so difficult to do so. And as you're thinking about what's that right sort of sweet spot, I think you need to look at the experience that companies have had and where they've grown and where they're deciding to place their bets going forward. I think that's a very important distinction to make.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with Aiden's comments more. I mean, from a hiring and a safety perspective, and from company expansion, all those additional regulations in California. As someone who we're a few steps behind Waymo in California in terms of the permitting process, but looking at moving through that, all it does is incentivize hiring more lawyers and outside consultants than it does incentivize hiring a lot, actual expanding and more safety folks. What we've seen in Nevada, for example, is they've really struck a really strong balance with these two different incentives here. They follow the self-certification approach that is the standard in the automotive industry. So they lay out the base level requirements, very similar requirements to what we see in Texas and elsewhere. And organizations, self-certify that they follow those requirements. They provide them to the the lead agencies, and they can move forward with their testing. But I think what all those Texas, Nevada, even Pennsylvania, what they're really getting right here is just open lines of communication with developers. They don't have to necessarily hit everything in a regulatory line item here. Our doors are always open with regards to conversations, and we're always meeting with our counterparts within these different agencies to make sure they know what we are up to, and that if they have questions, we can make sure to answer those. Because these vehicles are doing some really incredible things, but it is quite early stages, and a lot of times it's just some necessary education that needs to happen.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Bruce, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anna.
Yes. Hello, Anna Zievarts here. I'm with Disability Rights Washington Disability Mobility Initiative. And question for both of you, two questions. First, around wheelchair accessibility of your current fleets and how you plan to address that. And then the second question is a sort of a broader question around algorithmic bias in how these camera systems and AI are detecting or not detecting people with different mobility disabilities, people with different skin tones. I pasted a link in the chat from a recent study from DRADF, the Disability Rights Education Fund, that explores some of these issues and has some recommendations. And I'd like to hear as well, how you are addressing algorithmic bias that may not be able to recognize people who move differently or move with different kinds of mobility aids as people on the public right away. Thanks.
I can maybe jump in and answer it. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Sam.
So just with regards to the second part of the question, algorithmic bias, we involve folks with all different levels of accessibility at the very beginning of our testing. And so we have folks that have cognitive differences, that have hard of sight, hard of vision, involved from the very beginning doing our user experience testing, so to make sure that from the inside of the vehicle and being able to use the vehicle, they're fully brought in, and that they are also involved in some of the early data analysis and gathering to make sure that we're not over biasing towards certain types of populations, and that we are recognizing those different styles of walking and movement, and that our vehicle, when you get inside, has different ways of interacting with it, be it through audio only, visual only, tactile, and that we're taking those different pieces of feedback into account in designing it. Our current, just for the first part of the question with regards to wheelchair accessibility, it is possible to use our vehicle with a wheelchair. It's not a fully certified WAV with a ramp and things like that, but we've tested with a number of folks that have wheelchairs and have been able to get into the vehicle. So it's something we're always looking to improve. Automotive vehicles have a development timeline of years, almost a decade. And so we are looking at ways to better include that in our future models to make sure it's even easier than in our current platform.
And a couple quick things I'd point out here regarding, first off, on the second piece, the algorithmic bias. What the vehicle is able to see as far as the cameras, LiDAR, radar, et cetera, it basically builds a wireframe of what's going on dynamically in the environment. The vehicle can, and if you take a ride in a Waymo, you'll see this, the vehicle can actually basically pick out things as shaped from like a cone on the street to a stroller to a bicycle. It is basically seeing and building that image for itself. Now, one of the distinctions, and I'd like to make this sort of very clear for folks and for the representatives that are on the video call as well, there's a distinction between facial recognition versus facial identification. And what our vehicle is doing is it is identifying human being, 5'6", stationary, facing away from the street, right? For example, it is not identifying Aiden Ali Sullivan, brown skin, what have you. It doesn't know who it is. It doesn't care who it is. All the vehicle needs to identify is that it's a human, it's a dog, it's a person this high, they're moving at this rate of speed, etc., to be able to plot movement. But from a bias standpoint, there's no need for any further recognition because all the vehicle is doing is, again, plotting movements and making a course of action based on those movements. So it doesn't matter if it's a Black person moving or an Asian person moving, that doesn't make any difference to the vehicle. And so that's one of the, I think, strong benefits. Additionally, from a bias standpoint, as you think about, well, where will the car drive to? Who will the car pick up? It'll go to any neighborhood, it doesn't care. It'll pick up any passenger, it doesn't care who they are. These are things that from a bias that humans have, machines don't have those same biases. Last piece I'll say from a wheelchair accessibility, we don't build the vehicles, we partner with OEM manufacturers. We build the ADS system. So right now, I'll be honest, the Jaguar I-Pace is not wheelchair accessible. We do have an equivalent service that we're able to offer in San Francisco for folks. We are looking at building a purpose-built vehicle as our next generation car that would allow for much larger doors, ingress, egress, etc. That includes us working with the manufacturers. And as Sam mentioned, it's a very long timeline. And so today, do I have a wheelchair accessible vehicle? I don't. We certainly aspire to that. That's something that we're working on, and we're working with manufacturers of the next generation vehicle to be able to provide that service. And last thing here, I did see a question regarding cost in the chat. I don't know what the per mile basis is. What I can say based on my experience, and I see the charges for rides in Phoenix and in San Francisco, it is basically equivalent to what a similar Uber or Lyft ride would take. It's not any more expensive. Again, as we put vehicles out on the market at scale, we'll be able to reduce that fare because you'll just have economies of scale with fleets that are being able to utilize higher percentages.
Thank you so much, Aiden. We had one more quick request from Representative Kloba. She asked, could you provide the VSSA link?
Indeed, yep, I will find it and send it to you. And Representative, I'm happy to hear you on the line. I know this is a space that you've been very interested and involved in, and we appreciate the work that you've done and look forward to continuing to work with you.
All right, now we have Representative Leonard Christian, and welcome, Representative, to the work group.
Wow, thank you very much. Timing is kind of everything. Last week I was watching the news where they were doing world news where they're doing I guess highlighting these autonomous vehicles, and the one ride share that they had requested basically jammed up the entire road, and they had to send somebody to literally go and get in there and drive it out of the way. It was a construction related event. Anyway, is it possible that these vehicles could be taken over remotely, and instead of having to send somebody out there, it took them well over 25 minutes to get somebody to that vehicle, the whole time blocking traffic? So is there some way to, from the control center, to take over that vehicle with a person right then and there and save all that time?
Yeah, Representative, I'm not sure, what company that was. I can make certain assumptions. I don't believe it was one of our vehicles in San Francisco that caused the traffic jam. I know there was a lot of news last week with multiple vehicle strandings. As far as sort of remote capabilities, we do not have any type of sort of remote joystick control capabilities of the cars. All of the abilities of the vehicle to operate itself are sort of inherent on the car. We don't want to have to joystick the car around. What we can do is triage from afar, like, hey, what is the vehicle seeing? If the vehicle encounters sort of a novel situation, we can look at it, see what it is, and provide inputs for the ADS system. The system, though, can, should, and is able to navigate itself around or out of any type of complex situations. That's as far as our vehicle, that's the abilities we have. If there's a significant issue on the vehicle, or if there's a driver issue where they need someone to come out, you are able to call for someone to provide assistance. And what we've seen, again, I can speak to my company, what we've seen on average, I think the average in San Francisco was about 4 minutes for us to come out for driver assistance. Of course, there's outliers on any data set, larger numbers, but by and large, that has not been an issue for us needing to or causing major issues where it's taken half an hour for someone to come out to a vehicle.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for your response. Next is from Greg Spots. Greg.
Hi, everybody. Greg Spots, Seattle Department of Transportation Director. Just wanted to sound a note of caution about the language of balancing safety versus, encouraging innovation. I mean, the way I've been running SDOT from the beginning in the last year is putting safety over everything, and that's non-negotiable. Safety over queuing, safety over traffic. That's a big change to traditional traffic engineering. So I think safety is a non-negotiable thing. I would never want to go to a memorial of somebody who was killed and tell them, well, I was balancing safety against business development of these very exciting technologies. So I think a better way to look at it is ensuring that a safety-oriented regulatory framework is manageable for all the participants, and that the paperwork and the overhead in doing it is reasonable. But I think it's worrisome to use the language of balancing safety against other concerns.
And Greg, one thing I'd say on that note, language aside, I think what's important to note is sort of the on-the-ground experience. And as you look at operations, for example, in San Francisco, the vehicle prioritizes, and I'm sure Sam would say the same, we prioritize safety over everything. And so if that means the vehicle pulls over, and if that means that it perhaps inconveniences folks around the car for a couple minutes because it's pulled over, then so be it. And so from an experience standpoint, we indeed prioritize safety over everything, over speeding through or over sort of going through a complex situation that maybe we shouldn't, or that maybe a human would try and push through. Our car will pull over and wait and make sure we figure it out and choose that safe path, even if it means that, cars got stuck behind us for a couple minutes. And so, if you took me saying safety versus innovation as a balance, that's just me speaking here. But the reality on the ground is that the vehicles and the vehicle operations, the vehicle systems, the ADS, are programmed and operate to ensure that safety is the number one input and number one deciding factor in what those operations on the ground look like.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And maybe just to give you one example, we haven't had a single at-fault incident in our operations in Las Vegas, but the single largest type of incident we've had is our vehicle going the speed limit and an aggressive driver trying to pass us in a place that really, like, they shouldn't have been doing so, and having a very low speed fender bender. Like, that's when we're talking about safety here. I mean, these are our vehicles are operating by the rules much more in a degree, to the extent possible, 100% to what the rules of the road and the intention of the roadway designers are, compared to other humans here. So I just want to make sure we're also keeping in context what we're being compared against here, which is an enormous amount of human drivers that are driving distracted, that are driving drunk, driving tired, or just plain driving aggressively.
And Director, I'd love, if you're able to get down to San Francisco, I'd love to take you for a ride so you can experience what our operations look like. Feel free to let me know if you're ever either in Phoenix or in San Francisco. Same goes for any of the representatives on the line or any of the members of this group on the line. Love to take you for rides.
Thank you so much, Aiden, and thank you, Sam. Next, we have Representative Shelley Kloba.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I would, actually, this is to both of the Waymo and Motional folks. So when you do have those kinds of situations where that Representative Christian was talking about, something has gone wrong and you have to send a person out. What exactly happens there? I mean, do they jump in the car and drive it to a different, if it's in its safety mode, drive it to somewhere else where it can then proceed? Or just what does that look like? The news doesn't report that part. It's not very glamorous, but I'm curious.
So I can at least speak from Motional's perspective here. So generally, the specific situation, it's going to highly depend on exactly what's happening. And, there's a number of different classifications of how serious, a stoppage would be. At the lowest level, let's say, for example, there's some unanticipated construction on the roadway that we weren't aware of, that our maps weren't updated for, and there's someone directing traffic in an unusual way, or they're not wearing the proper vests or something along those lines. Like Aiden, it was mentioned with Waymo, emotional systems we don't have a remote operator that is, in a cockpit somewhere driving the vehicle remotely. What we do have though is folks that can look at contextual information, look at cameras, look at sensors, and propose a path to our vehicle. And that's how we frequently will resolve some of these lower level issues. We tell the vehicle, hey, it looks like this, they're directing your traffic in this perhaps unusual way. We're going to recommend you go this direction. And it's up to the onboard vehicle safety system to make sure that that is indeed safe. And that if it is, it'll proceed in the path that has been recommended. And that's how we're able to unblock, the majority of slowdowns is those, the remote vehicle assistance there. Now, in the event it's a much more, perhaps more serious or more unusual situation where the vehicle is unable to get out of a situation, we have a number of kind of remote teams that are positioned around where we operate, and they can quickly go to the vehicle. And our vehicles do have manual controls. And so at the worst case scenario, they can get into the vehicle, disengage the autonomous system, and drive it to either a remote depot or back to our depot area. So that's kind of the main situations, but I would say that the vast majority are being resolved through remote vehicle assistance.
Representative Klobuchar, I'll just add on there, very, very similar to what Sam said. I sort of think of it as like, calling AAA, right? In the vast majority of situations, the vast majority of rides, we don't need any type of rider assistance to go out. In the small number of situations where the vehicle pulls over, it's able to resolve itself through external triage, as Sam mentioned, and as I mentioned that we're able to do. And in a very small number of cases, we do send out a team to extract the vehicle if necessary. One of the situations we've seen, again, these are edge cases, but just to give you an example, they often make the news, right? That a car is stuck, and the autonomous vehicle didn't know what to do, and it blocked traffic. And you'll look at the videos, and you'll see that there's 50 people around the car videoing and showing that this car is stuck. Well, the reason the car is stuck is because there's 50 people around it, and it can't move because the car's not going to drive through people. Whereas a human might try and nudge through a crowd of folks. Again, to Director Spott's point, from a safety perspective, we're not going to nudge through human beings. And so in some cases, we have to go out and send a team to clear the folks around the car to allow the car to extract itself. So these are things that are just sort of differences between machine-driven cars versus human-driven cars. And again, you'll see in the news, well, a car got stuck. Well, why did it get stuck? It's important to unpack it. And these are, again, to the regulatory point, questions that oftentimes I get from California DMV. They'll say, Aiden, I want to talk about X, Y, or Z incident. And so I will have a conversation with them, and I'll have to triage and explain what happened, why it happened. And when I explain it to them, they say, oh, yes, that makes sense. And that is good behavior because you don't want to drive through a crowd of folks. But it's sort of red meat for folks that are opposed to it to, post something on Twitter and create a lot of something out of nothing. So from a, that extraction standpoint, it's a very, very rare situation where we have to send out a team. But of course, in all of the cars, we're able to disengage the ADS, and there's still a driving a steering wheel in the car that a human can drive if necessary.
Thank you, Aiden. And thank you all for the questions. We are running a little bit late. So Daniela, you're the last question that we're going to take on this subject. Daniela Bremer, representing WashDOT Secretary Roger Millar.
Yes, good morning. I just want to, for context, provide a couple of perspectives from my experience, and I appreciate all the conversations on this, and it's definitely a tricky conversation, but I spent an hour with two, one European and one American traffic engineer driving in San Francisco in a robotaxi, and all over San Francisco at night in all kinds of conditions. We kept changing the direction of our destination in order to extend the ride, and we were really testing the vehicle left and right because those two engineers were trying all kinds of scenarios. We encountered random pedestrians. Looks like somebody may be under the influence walking across the street. We encountered responders, emergency vehicles. We encountered construction site, heavy traffic. I was really impressed with the response of the robotaxi, and I was really amazed compared to 2 years ago when I was able to ride in one, and the difference. So I guess there will be always exceptions, but I feel like from the perspective of a user that was sitting in the car and actually trying to get from point A to point B in San Francisco. It was very impressive how this vehicle handled the situation. There is some clunkiness, and the traffic engineers in the car with me made a list of things they would like to change. But I think overall, the experience was very positive, and we talked to a lot of people who have used robotaxis at that conference we were at, and I think there was just a couple of people who had some interesting experiences where I might have stopped and waited a little bit too long to move on and try to figure out where to go next. But overall, everyone who participated, and there was like 800 people, I think at least half of them drove, transportation professionals who understand traffic rules, and were very, very impressed. So I just want to provide that for context. I'm not a traffic engineer, and so I cannot weigh in on the ins and outs of the behavior of the robotaxis in some of the situations, but I felt as a citizen user, as somebody who wants to go from one point to point B, I was very comfortable.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I appreciate your comments. Okay, folks. Thank you so much, Aiden and Sam. We appreciate your presentation this morning. If there are additional questions, we will go ahead and get those to you so you can follow up. Thank you again. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker is Dr. Phil Koopman, Associate Professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and Bill Wyden, Professor of Law, University of Miami. They're going to discuss AV safety regulatory needs. Gentlemen, you have the floor.
Thank you. Are you able to see my screen and hear me?
Yes, I am.
Sounds great. Okay. So I'm Phil Koopman. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I've been doing self-driving car safety for more than 25 years. And one of the topics that comes up is how safe is safe enough. And I dug into that, and 350 pages or whatever later, there's a book on that. So you can safely say that I'm really, really up to speed on self-driving car safety. And what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to, if I can get my slide advance to work, I'm going to talk about getting past some of the safety rhetoric. I'm going to talk about autonomous vehicle safety in a nutshell. And I have some specific policy points, and then I'll revisit some common myths. This talk will probably run 20 minutes. Professor Wyden's following me. He has a shorter talk, so we should still be fine for Q&A in a time slot. So I'm running a couple minutes late. Don't worry about that. One of the things I want to address at the beginning is there's a tremendous difference that ordinary folks in ordinary experience, it takes a while for them to sort of get how safety is different from normal operation. There's cars that drive down the street and have a lot of good trips and don't crash into things, and that's great. They're competent at driving, but there's a big gap between that and safety. Now, I would give you some numbers because we've heard, well, most of the time, almost all the time, and sure, that's what you want to hear. But safety is a lot harder than that. So let me give you some completely hypothetical numbers just to illustrate it. Let's say you have a robotaxi from some company X that doesn't exist. This is not a real company. This robotaxi can drive 99 million miles, 999,998 miles with no fatalities, but there's 2 miles in which there's a fatality. Well, wow, 99 million and change, almost 100 million miles with no fatalities is one way to look at it. But the other way to look at it is 2 fatalities. That's twice the fatality rate of human drivers in San Francisco, depending on the year. It's an average. Okay, so safety isn't about the good driving experience. And I've been in these vehicles. They can be amazing. They're amazing most of the time. It's not about the good driving experiences, almost no matter how many you have. It's about how often do they make the really bad mistake, and it needs to be incredibly infrequent to be as good as human drivers. And by the way, that number of 100 million miles per fatality, that includes all the drunks and distracted. It gets way better if you take that out. So that's just some perspective. Now, I'm not opining on any of the companies here. I'm just pointing out how incredibly high the bar is set just to be as good as a human driver. Human drivers are actually pretty amazing, despite some of the rhetoric you might have heard. So let me dive in. The first thing is the rhetoric. People say robotaxis are not prone to human error. Well, that's true sort of by definition. They don't drink alcohol, but instead you get robot error. And so these are some news stories we've seen from San Francisco. There's a vehicle that went through some down Muni light rail power lines and dragged the power lines down the street and dragged the emergency tape from the scene down the street. And another one of it is coming behind, also dragging him down the street. I guess maybe a human driver would do that, but to keep driving with power lines that are potentially live, potentially very dangerous to passengers. Fortunately, these vehicles didn't have passengers in them. That's pretty bad. And you can say it's a rare situation, but it's not rare enough it didn't happen. I mean, there's the photograph. The next one is we saw a vehicle driving into fresh pavement. Now, it turns out people do this too. Rarely, they do it. And the point here isn't, I mean, other than it's entertaining because no one got hurt, I get that. But the point is not to say how bad the robotaxis are. The point is to say they will make mistakes just like people do. So the narrative, they're not humans, so they don't make mistakes, therefore implied they will be perfect, is utter nonsense. They will make mistakes too, potentially for different reasons, but they absolutely make mistakes. And here's another one where a vehicle went down a construction zone that was really well marked after pausing. It's interesting. You can speculate that this was actually an issue that the remote person, and as mentioned before, they don't remotely drive with a joystick. There are really good reasons for that. It's good that they don't do that, so that's fine. But when it gets stuck, they have to have a plan other than every time waiting, and they have a plan. But in this time, it's an interesting question to ask. Did it do this because the remote operator told it to do this because they saw a lane open, or did it do it for some other reason? We don't really know. But I'm just pointing out that operational proficiency, getting the operations to be high quality, is just as important as getting the technology to be high quality. So it's important to ask both questions when you're talking about permission. Okay, getting past the AV safety rhetoric. Nobody knows when these will be safer than human drivers. Nobody knows, because robots make mistakes too. The reduced fatality rates, you're hearing companies saying we're already saving lives. Well, that is marketing puffery. They've gone a few million miles, but it's 100 million miles between fatalities. So no one knows how that's going to turn out. It's like saying we're 1 kilometer into a marathon, our splits look awesome, so give us our medal. No, you don't get the medal yet. I mean, it's great. And so to be clear, everything we've seen from Waymo in particular, they have some nice analysis, that looks like they're on track. That's great, but it's too early to claim victory. Some human drivers drive drunk. Yep, that's right. But on average, they're still pretty good. And that does not mean automatically the robots will be better. We just saw that. Computers lack common sense, and machine learning, the technology behind a lot of this, is really brittle when it encounters something it's not seen before. But even for stuff you can foresee, and even for stuff that should not be ambiguous, we've heard about the sensors. So it used to be, I've been doing this a long time, people said a robotaxi would never hit something like a bus because the LiDAR sensor, assuming it has one, will see the bus and it won't hit it. And yet, here's the photo of that happening in San Francisco. Well, what's going on? Well, just because the LiDAR and all those cameras and all those sensors can see it does not mean the software will operate defect-free. So there was a software defect that caused this crash. It saw the bus, but it hit it anyway. So again, I'm not saying whether they're more dangerous or less dangerous than human drivers. I'm just saying the rhetoric saying they're computers, therefore they never make mistakes. I mean, I guess people who write that have never used computers. I have all sorts of problems with a computer. My cell phone crashes all the time. These are hopefully designed to a higher standard, although the companies are pretty opaque about that. But you can't just say it's a computer, so it'll be perfect. That isn't what's going to happen. It has to be engineered to be safe. There are safety standards that tell you how to do that. But with a couple exceptions, you don't see the companies really saying they're actually going to follow the safety standards. They just sort of talk about their engineering. Okay, so if you want to be safe, again, I started with what does safe mean? Well, safe means, starts with driving down the road, okay? But it turns out that the safer than human driver narrative isn't enough to be as safe as you and I would want on the streets, probably. And I'll explain why I say that. You want to be safer net statistically than human driver. In San Francisco in the last 5 years, depending which year, it's 75 to 125 million miles between for fatality, including all the impaired drivers. We have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 million miles, depending which press release you read. That's cool, 95 million miles to go to see how it turns out. And I hope it turns out great, but again, it's too early to really be sure. So the takeaway there is It's okay to say probably it will improve safety, but you cannot make decisions saying it's guaranteed it'll improve safety. Let's just assume that. Let's move on knowing they're safer, because we don't know that yet. You also need to avoid risk transfer onto vulnerable populations. If you had half the fatality rate, but all of them were pedestrians, that's not a good thing. Now, I hope it doesn't turn out that way, but pedestrian fatalities are up recently. That seems to be a trend for regular cars. It's not okay to say our net rate is lower, but there's these at-risk populations that are actually at more risk because of the technology. You also have to avoid negligent computer driving. Even if you cut the number of fatalities in half, if every fatality is some robotaxi ran a red light and hit something, that's going to be a problem. By the same token, if the number of crashes is increased compared to the baseline, even if it was never the robotaxi's fault, if you have more harm, you have more harm, and the blame doesn't really mitigate that. Okay, so whenever you say, well, we're lower harm at blame, they need to also say, yeah, and we're lower harm total as well. Blame doesn't mean the crash didn't happen, and there are plenty of ways. You've probably all seen human drivers that they wouldn't have gotten a ticket, but they did something really stupid that caused a crash. Well, that's not okay either. They should conform to industry standards. There's the SAJ 3018 for public road testing, which one company who's not in operation anymore followed, and I'm not aware of any current company who says they follow. It's like a dozen pages. None of the companies will say they follow. This is to keep the roads safe while there's human safety drivers. There's much more rigorous standards, and the companies will say, well, we looked at them, we do some of the things, but I haven't seen any company saying they're actually conform with the standards. And that's how you know you're safe before you start the road testing. And there's other ethical and equity concerns you should address. If anyone's interested in digging deeper, I have a preprint paper I can send individuals at this point. But to me, when you're doing safety, you have to hit all these points. You can't just hit some of them. Now, let me do some policy points. And I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. You have the slides. I'm happy to answer questions. The slides are there mostly to nail them down so people can dig deeper. But companies say we're going to have societal benefit. Well, you're not going to really know until later if you're going to get the societal benefit. Realize they're aspirational statements, and aspirational statements okay, but don't take them as truth because we don't know how it's going to turn out. And in particular, safe might come at this expense of reliability. I agree that stopping in the road for a few seconds to be safe is great, but once you stop for 15, 20, 30 minutes and are blocking emergency vehicles, that's a different type of safety. That's public safety instead of passenger safety, and that also matters. So ask, what are the benefits right now? At the California PUC meeting, we heard that, in fact, this will help the disabled, but we don't have wheelchair access now. Okay, but California PUC did not require some percentage of the fleet to have wheelchair access. They just granted permission. Already saving lives, well, we don't know that yet. Or we're going to, in general, we're going to promise unprofitable thing X, trust us because we're good actors, might be a great promise. You might believe them. They might intend and sincerely believe they're going to do it. But if there's not a regulation holding them to the promise when there's a bad quarter, we're going to have to see what happens. Also ask what public costs there will be, and they may be blocked emergency responders. There may be some increased harm if some company puts out a bad software patch and maybe it starts hitting something. Some things. We've seen injury crashes from both Cruise and Waymo in San Francisco at some point. That may not be fully known, but we've seen injury crashes to passengers to both of them in the last month. Now, in several cases, they're blaming the other guy, but they happened. So you have to take this seriously. People can get hurt, and it's important to be careful. And the question long term is the net rate lower? And the 5 points I just said, are they going to meet those? We don't know yet. But it's not a sure thing that these things will be perfectly safe. Public policy point for public road testing, there's no such thing as driverless testing. When you take the driver out, it had better be safe. Saying that you're testing without a driver means you're seeing whether or not it crashes because there's no driver to stop it. So driverless testing is a very problematic concept unless you're testing the business model rather than the safety of the car. It was mentioned earlier that some states have friendlier regulations. Arizona famously welcomed the self-driving cars in right away, and they're the place where the fatal crash happened. This was a testing driver crash, and the testing drivers had criminal charges for not paying attention, but the National Transportation Safety Board set a much a huge underlying problem was the safety culture at the company. It wasn't all on the driver. So realize that if you're authorizing testing, this kind of thing can happen. And I would recommend requiring this standard. It's like a dozen pages of how to make sure your test drivers are professional and pay attention. Why wouldn't you require them following their own industry standard? So driver out testing should be for the business model, not for safety. Moving on to the next policy point. I'm going through them quickly. We can come back, circle back and discuss any one of these of interest in the Q&A. Municipal preemption. Lots of states have a municipal preemption clause, which says that the cities and other regional governments cannot do anything to the AVs. They can't interfere at all. And they argue the cities will ban all AV testing if given a chance. There are ways around that. Okay. And by the way, how's that working out in San Francisco? We're seeing San Francisco government really upset. Now there's both sides stories about who wants to talk to whom and all this other stuff. And you know, that is maybe. The fact is San Francisco in part is upset because they're not allowed to do anything as this plays out on their streets. And that's putting their constituents causing real problems with their constituents. We're talking dozens of interference with emergency responders, you know, things of this. Set aside the traffic jams, the interference with emergency responders is a big deal. There's a middle ground. It doesn't have to be that way. You could have a state law that says, well, you know, cities can't ban it, okay, but they can make restrictions responsive to specific local conditions. For example, school zones during student transit times. Is that really when you want to have the first drive of a driver out test? Is that really it? Parades, construction areas, fires, First Amendment events. These are all problematic for the companies. Why don't you consider maybe a city should have the ability to ban testing and then be required to work with the companies to make sure they're informed where the keep out areas are. Maybe after something really bad happens, like there's a blockage of emergency scenes, the municipalities can selectively suspend service responsive to the incidents, partially suspend it saying, hey, you're not allowed to go within 2 blocks of a fire scene, for example. Okay, so the idea is to give them some power that if they notice a pain point, they can put in a temporary measure to bring the pain point under control till they can work out some longer range thing. And maybe the state doesn't need to get involved. Hopefully the companies are good actors and say, you're right. And so we'll work with you on this. And by the way, municipalities must be able to enforce traffic laws. We've seen some draft bills pushed by the industry that would forbid that. There was one of those, I've seen that in several states. You know, these are the kind of things to pay attention to. The next thing is that SAE level 2, 2+, and 3 vehicles, those are typically the ones not as much in mind. They're not robotaxis, right? But we're seeing a lot of fatalities and crashes due to driver complacency. There's level 3 is in town, and that says that you can take off your eyes off the road and literally play Tetris on the dashboard. This is a promotional from Mercedes. They're having the guy play Tetris on the dashboard, looks like, okay? And who's liable? Well, Mercedes says they're responsible for product liability, but that's not the question. The question is tort and criminal liability. Does the driver go to jail if the car hits someone and kills them while he's playing Tetris? And the answer is very unclear. So Professor Wyden and I have a proposal to create a clear duty of responsibility for the computer driver so that we can do this up front instead of waiting a couple decades for the court system to hash this out. Almost done here, should be on time. The last policy point is federal versus state regulation. This is tricky because the feds regulate the equipment, the states regulate the driver, and now the driver's equipment. And so I have a proposal for this that the feds should control equipment, but not the behavior of the equipment in total, but rather the ability to adhere to whatever the state laws might be. Now, NHTSA proposed this in a framework in December 2020 that has hundreds of comments that have never been responded to. The feds need to act on this, but they already have a framework to ensure safety of the equipment based on industry consensus standards. So that's there, it just needs to move forward. But the state should retain control of computer driver behavior. They should hold computer drivers to the same duty of care as a human driver. And I think practically, because the equipment regulations take so long, the actions for the next 5 to 10 years is all going to be in tort law, being able to make sure that computer drivers are held to the same duty of care as human drivers, because the product liability cases create tremendous resource usage and take a long time. You know, you should be able to give a computer driver a ticket for running a red light if it does that. And there should be real consequences instead of, no, there's no driver, so you can't give a ticket. In San Francisco, they literally can't ticket a robotaxi because there's no driver. Make sure you take care of that one. Okay, last slide, some quick list of myths. Computers don't drive drunk. Computers lack common sense. They make mistakes. So don't buy into the computers drive drunk, therefore, I'm sorry, computers don't drive drunk, so people will be bad and computers will be perfect. Just don't buy into that. That's just propaganda, really. Humans are terrible drivers, computers are safer. It's the same thing. We don't know how it will turn out. I hope it turns out well. Some of the companies have data showing they're on track to win the race. We're not there yet, and we won't be there for a long time. Level 2 and 2+ makes cars safer. There's a bunch of studies saying that autopilot type systems make cars safer. They've all been debunked. Automatic emergency braking is great stuff. The studies show that make it safe, they make it safer, but there's no data I've ever seen that automated steering makes cars safer. And the data I have seen says that it decreases safety, at least in some models. We, the manufacturer, take responsibility, but then it's for product liability, which isn't what matters. It's tort and criminal law that matter. And so be very careful if you hear a company telling you this. And current laws and regulations are enough. That's just downright false. There are liability issues, there's software safety regulation issues, there's the level 2 loophole that they're unregulated, but it's almost but not quite a robotaxi, things like that. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Wyden. If you have the slides, there's a bunch of things you can look up. Turn to Professor Wyden to finish, and then we'll do joint Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Professor Wyden.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to unmute myself. I have a few slides. What I'm going to show you is some things that I'm currently thinking about. It's research that'll show up in a paper shortly. Let's see. I have this up on my screen. So what is going to happen to the tort system if you end up shifting from human drivers to computer drivers? The consensus seems to be that there's going to be a shift in the type of case. You would eliminate the negligence suit and you'd be transforming yourself to a product liability suit. I have a citation here that you can look at where academic study says by eliminating the human driver, autonomous vehicles will eliminate these tort claims. Those are negligence claims. You can see that most of the industry seems, although they aren't as express as they might be, seem to be saying when they take responsibility that they're taking responsibility for the design, not necessarily the performance without reference to the design. Now, a negligence suit differs from a product liability suit in many ways. The number of ordinary negligence cases dwarfs the number of product liability auto accident cases. A product liability case requires expensive experts, and a judge and a lay jury can resolve most negligence cases without expert input or expense. If you want to look at some numbers, the federal courts have studies that are very, very current. The most recent report had in the federal courts 278 product liability suits for motor vehicles and 5,517 negligence cases. It's somewhat more dated, but the US Department of Justice used to keep state statistics. The most recent they did was 2005, and they were taking a mere sample of state court activity. And for motor vehicles, there were like 9,431 cases, and they had 268 product liability cases. You can see here from that study the relative percentages that I have, and the motor vehicles being the vast majority. Product liability, the other category, doesn't necessarily include only automotive. So even if the transition takes place slowly, the resource constraints could be significant. And a change in law to allow a negligence suit for an AV accident based on breach of a duty of care would address these resource concerns for the typical auto accident case. The example, we have it in some published work. There was a case where GM in a suit in California called Nilsson v. GM admitted that their vehicle owed a duty of care to the public. Once you recognize that an AV owes other road users a duty of care, the only remaining step is to hold the manufacturer responsible. And the only logical party to motivate safety improvements is the manufacturer. And here you can see the citation to the case and the admission in the answer to the complaint. GM admits that the Bolt was required to use reasonable care in driving. Okay, that is what I think the rule should be, and I think that tort law will eventually develop that way. But if you look at the history of how long it took to get strict product liability, it took decades. And if you're going to put and want to develop public trust, it seems to me one way to go is to have a very clear liability standard. I mean, frankly, from my perspective, if you had clear channels of liability, I would consider giving the companies close to carte blanche to do whatever they wanted on the roads, subject to having a recall or some other emergency action if you found very disturbing patterns. And so the real question is, will this be accomplished by a statute contemporaneously with the AV deployments? And you need to consider what will protect the citizens the best. An example where statutes intervened early was the electronic signature. The courts eventually might have found that a signature on a PDF satisfied the statute of frauds, but it was so important to business that they actually passed laws to validate the use of an electronic signature. Here's an example where Mercedes argues against law reform. They say that while there may be differences in jurisdictions, the current system provides the legal foundation that's the basis of the respective tasks and duties, and they'll continue to apply and assign liability. Well, not so much. If you have a situation where, hang on here, if you have a situation where you're dealing with products liability, it was developed originally to benefit plaintiffs by eliminating the need to prove negligence, but the complexity of the proof has become a liability shield in the cases involving very complex technology. And that's basically a very big problem going forward. I have here a study that came out earlier this month, which confirms what people say, that if you're looking at a machine that's driven by machine learning and neural networks, that they're basically opaque and you're not able to even trace computer code like you might if you were testing, let's say, phantom braking or something of that sort. Now, the complexity of proof, I would say, isn't really necessary because an ADS has to comply with traffic laws. And to comply with traffic laws, the ADS designer must program a duty of care behavior into the automated vehicles. I have a site here where that's discussed from 2022, where they have the principle that the ADS will be programmed to maintain a strict duty of care to each road user. In this particular case, they use this fact to solve the trolley problem by claiming that, let's see, what else do I have? So, you know, I would compare the AV industry to the rail industry, and I would say that the new technology raises a host of novel problems and will end up putting unprecedented demands on the legal system. And so I think you should use common law as well as statutes could eventually address the problem. It's going to get worse if they'll accumulate as you get more and more deployments. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you so much, both of you gentlemen, both Dr. Koopman and Dr. Wyden. We have one question from David Forte representing the OIC. David.
Yeah, hi, David Fort representing Insurance Commissioner Mike Kreidler. I have two questions. One, have you put any thought into data collection during a motor vehicle accident to help reduce the cost for insurers and consumers to help assign liability?
Well, Phil can tell you technically how that would be done, but currently the data recorder on a vehicle records certain information, and there's specific additional information that could be collected. And actually the feds, I think, could require it to happen, that would enable you to forensically determine, for example, preserving the videos from the 5 minutes before a crash and making them available to law enforcement or to litigants. And so it might be the case with all the data being collected that it would be a relatively easy matter to determine who was at fault. And PS, the fault standard, I think, would exonerate a lot of cases where an AV actually gets into an accident. I'm not a fan. We were thinking a long time about strict liability. I'm not a fan of strict liability for automated vehicles.
The technical societies are working on standards on exactly that topic. I think there's one that's near publication or almost published, but I'm not on that committee, so I can't say more. But the IEEE in particular, I think that's the Computer Engineering Technical Society is working on that. So that's something to check out, but there are technical standards in process.
Thank you. And just real quick, one more question. Since this AV software is transporting humans and things, should we consider them to be common carriers with that standard of care?
I would be satisfied to not have them held to a common carrier in every case. But to the extent that a state has special regulation, let's say for a taxi driver, okay, I would just say use that whatever that regulation is in that state and apply it to the AV. But in the abstract, if you simply held the AV to an ordinary negligence standard, I would be okay with that. You certainly could enhance it if you wanted based on special situations. And you might want to do that, let's say, if you were using an AV for trucking and they were doing something like platooning the trucks, you might say, well, I want a higher standard in that area, but it would be a big win, I think, if you just applied ordinary negligence to all of the passenger traffic.
And I would add that a lot of the common carrier rules are for the safety of the passengers, and that's fine. But if you see a lot of these autonomous vehicles with no passengers, cargo delivery or between rides, the safety of the other road users becomes actually a much bigger concern. And so common carrier may not be enough because I'm not an expert in the area, but my understanding is that's not what it focuses on. But that's very likely to be the worst issue with this technology, that you need to mitigate the harm to other road users more than the people inside.
Thank you so much. Next question is from Daniela Bremer, representing WashDOT Secretary Roger Millar.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Martin, Dr. Koopman. I had the pleasure to meet Dr. Koopman in California so recently. It was a pleasure to have you on the panel. I have a question on the preemption conversation. You mentioned this middle ground. I'm really interested because we have a lot of pressure on Washington State to require preemption of our local jurisdictions. And I'm wondering if there's any sort of examples that you could share with us that showed these successful sort of approaches to at this middle ground of avoiding the municipal preemption. I think our city of Seattle and Bellevue that have almost testing and technology deployment activities have done a great job working with the private sector. I think that's really commendable, and I think there's a great relationship of the people who are working in this space. But there's continued pressure to request preemption of local jurisdictions in Washington. So I'm just curious if there's any examples you can point us to, and thank you for your comments.
Let me start, and then I'll defer to Professor Wyden to finish. In terms of an example of a state having done this, I'm not aware of any, because the industry has been very successful and effective at lobbying to get preemption. That happened in Pennsylvania. It happened lots of places. And they have various tactics and techniques they use to get there. So they've been able to push preemption across the country in many, many states. And there was a comment earlier about Seattle, which I think is a great comment. The comment there was, and I'm paraphrasing, is things are going fine in Seattle, and my concern is not that the companies will necessarily be bad actors. It's much more that the cities need to have the ability to push back if the companies push too hard. I'd prefer that everyone got along and preemption is certainly an issue. But if if the companies are armed with preemption and they can do whatever they want and there's really no consequences, then the cities are really put at a disadvantage, and that's bad for the cities. Now, on the other hand, I can see the companies don't want to have a complete ban. I get that, which is why we do partial. We suggest partial,
Right.
But the key there is responsive to local conditions as opposed to blanket either way. Professor Wyden, it's yours now.
Right. I think you also have to differentiate the problems that arise in testing from the problems that arrive when you have deployment. Okay. And then you sort of, with some of these robo-taxis, you're kind of in a middle zone. One of the concerns that I have is that companies don't have to ensure and provide to the city a testing plan that shows that it's non-discriminatory. I would not like to see testing going on in historically disadvantaged neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods. An example in San Francisco would be the Tenderloin District, which is very difficult to navigate and has a lot of people that if you killed because they're drug users or other things, your payout, if you had to make a payout, would be much lower. And so there's actually a financial incentive to test in low-income neighborhoods. And what I'm terrified will happen is if you had a situation with a very serious accident, I would like to see the companies have a defense, which is, no, we weren't targeting the people in this neighborhood. In fact, we had a plan on file with the city. We talked to the local leaders and made sure that we had a non-discriminatory testing plan. And I tried to get that. I talked behind the scenes with people in Pennsylvania. I have a paper on that was published last year that goes into how to make these things non-discriminatory that way. And I do think even when you're not dealing with testing, I get nervous if you don't have the ability. Let's say there's people that worship on Friday in the evening and they're wearing, maybe they're Orthodox Jewish people and they're wearing clothing that might not have been thoroughly tested through the machine learning testing. I would like to see the ability of a city to at least carve out certain protected times and areas. And I think that could be done with a statute that would really scale back the ability, because I certainly don't want testing. Testing has to occur in urban areas because that presents the most challenging environments. And it's also the area where you need to operate if you're going to make these systems financially viable.
Thank you, Dr. Wyden. Aidan, you have a question.
Yeah, and I'm hesitant to weigh in here because I wanted to allow the last speakers to provide their input, but I can't stay silent here. The comment about sort of targeting low-income communities and the ability for the vehicles to not be able to recognize a religious community wearing their clothes. I mean, just let's be very clear here. The cars need to be able and can recognize a human being, whether they're wearing a big shirt, a little shirt. I mean, that doesn't influence the ability of the vehicle to operate. And so I don't want anyone to
Aidan, that's simply not true. That's simply not true. We have data showing that clothing color caused.
I don't want to get into an argument here. I just want to miss it back on that point, but I'm done.
You may believe that for your system, but that is not an inherent property of the technology.
But the other thing I would say is that let's say that the technology is doing exactly what Aidan says. And I don't mean to ascribe bad motives, but I don't want to see even an innocent accident that takes place in a neighborhood to get used politically to make some kind of point. In other words, if you had certain of these non-discriminatory testing plans, for example, I think that would be simple insurance for the company so that somebody doesn't try to grab headlines by alleging that a company was doing something to make a political issue when it shouldn't be a political issue.
And that's fair. And the other thing I will say is any type of testing operations are fully vetted by regulators. They choose, for example, if we can operate in certain areas, if we can't operate on certain streets. And so the assumption that vehicles are operating with carte blanche in these geographies is simply not true. They're very specific, subscribed geographic areas. And within those geographic areas, there are additional restrictions that are placed by regulators on where and when companies can operate. And so, for example, they might shield off a street, they might shield off a region, they might shield off particular times of day. Again, there's this assumption that cars are just running amok, and that's simply not true. There are significant regulations that regulators place on testing and on commercial operations.
Right,
Okay,
but that's not the point. I mean, the point is, should that regulation be done at the state level, or should it be done at the local level, where presumably the local officials have a better understanding of the needs of local conditions, right? And so, yes, I mean, certainly the state could put limitations if they want, but it's not a question of the limitations so much as where they come from.
Let me add on top of that, that you're talking about California, and you've also argued that California has overly restrictive regulations. So if that representation of California is accurate, then that's great. Washington should do at least that as well, instead of having more lax regulations, part one. Part two, the comment that, I'm sorry I get a little worked up with stuff, but I mean, there's stuff we've seen that we just know is true. We know it doesn't see all people, and it depends on things like their clothing color. We've seen that. We also know that just because the sensors see a bus doesn't mean it won't hit the bus. So while in theory and in principle, it should be able to detect all people and all objects, we know that in practice, that doesn't always work out. And especially when the technology is immature, and especially during testing, these are the kind of concerns that need to be addressed by regulation to make sure you get good outcomes, so there's not a bad news event that hurts the technology before we can get all the way to the safety that's been promised.
And, I think a good compromise, if you get the liability rules right and you do what, for example, GM admitted, then at least from my legal perspective, I would like the companies to have as much reign as makes sense without regulation. And like I said, if I got new laws that made the liability channels clear, I would give the companies virtual carte blanche to do what they want, unless, of course, you found that, NHTSA or somebody found that there was a pattern with a particular model or something that needed a recall. I would just treat it the way that it's normally treated. And I would be careful that you have things in place to prevent somebody manufacturing a negative news story when in fact it's just grandstanding.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for the lively discussion. Appreciate all the presentation. We're going to go ahead and move on now. We've got the AV roadmap to the future draft document walkthrough with Vice President WSP Scott Shogan. Scott.
Good morning, everybody. Let me share my screen here. And moment here to go into presentation. Hopefully, are you all seeing that in presentation mode now?
We are, yes.
Okay, great. So we set this meeting up purposefully to follow those presentations. I think a lot of great information that really feeds into this discussion that we're going to have now. We have been doing this for almost 5 years now with this work group. And I think, what is clear is that a lot of work has been done and there's plenty more to do. And as we look at the sunset of this work group here at the end of this year, we have been developing really for the last year and a half with input from this group, we have been developing this roadmap to the future that's really intended to capture what is some of that unfinished business? What are some of those actions going forward, as much as we can kind of foresee where the industry is going, where those needs are going to be? What are some of those actions that the state is going to have to take going forward to help enable safe, effective deployment of these technologies and to manage through that process? So, again, I mentioned that we've been at this process really for the last year and a half, seeking input on each of these kind of 5 key components of the roadmap. They include agency readiness, testing and pilots, public outreach, safety, and path to deployment. So we're really excited today to go through with you all each of some of the initial recommendations and discussion points around each of these key components. Just to give a little bit of a look ahead to where we're going, we're going to talk about these today. For each of these components, we're going to go through some recommendations. We're going to pause and have an opportunity to get some feedback from you. We're going to use Mentimeter to capture that for those that want to put in comments directly. But also, are going to open up the mics and allow any comments or feedback along the way. We're going to capture that input and then also open for input for the next week. Further thoughts on the recommendations that you're going to see here today. We're going to then take that and develop out the actual written document that we hope to put forward as a recommendation coming out of the work group here at the end of the year. So with that, we're going to start into this and starting with agency readiness, talking about a few different topics that we've identified as go forward actions under agency readiness: permitting, training, infrastructure, equity, and partnership. So we're going to start with permitting. So I think, perfect segue from the last discussion that we just had, and acknowledging that that through this process, feedback coming from this committee, I think has really clearly identified a desire to look at some sort of a process or updating the process currently in place in Washington to really look more robustly at allowing AV operation. So what is in place today? Just as a refresher, the current process for AV operation is simply a self-certification process. Companies are required to have a $5 million umbrella liability policy. And there's different requirements for testing with or without human operators on board. And then there's also a collision report that's required each year for self-certified companies. So that is the process that's in place today. This document is really going to acknowledge there's multiple ways to proceed from here. And looking at how different states have kind of approached that. What we intend at this point is for this report to really put forward, there's not necessarily a consensus approach around this, but acknowledge that there is some need certainly for funding for some level of dedicated staff to improve the process and improve management of the process that is there today. What could that process look like? I think we've heard a lot in the last hour and a half on the different approaches to this. So, for example, in California, very robust approach that the DMV engages in terms of permitting, different levels of permitting, what have you. Contrasted with Arizona that we also heard about, much more open approach, kind of a more of a self-certification type of model. So essentially the recommendation in the roadmap here is to consider approaches, but provide adequate funding to really allow a more sustained approach to AV deployment and permitting as the state goes forward. So we're going to pivot from there to training and talk about this in the context of how, for agency readiness, how do state agencies continue to understand what is happening in the industry? What are some of the capabilities of the technologies? What are some of those challenges? Effectively, the last hour and a half has been a training, if you will. It's really been a lot of sharing of information that we've had multiple times a year through this forum as an AV work group. So going forward, what does that look like? The recommendation here is really to consider to find a path for continued training, continued exchange of information for state agencies that are responsible for deploying this technology. And there's multiple ways to do that. So several other states have created work groups of this nature without a statutory requirement to do so. Simply a desire to convene a forum around this topic. So Maryland is an example that has had a very long-running work group to allow that exchange of information. There are also examples at the national level, and one is the CAT Coalition, Cooperative Automated Transportation is the acronym there. Basically a coalition of partners that are, just kind of voluntary engagement across that group to exchange information as well. So there's multiple pathways to do that. Basically here a suggestion to continue this process even without the formality of the work group going forward. So infrastructure is another topic that has come up as we think about agency readiness and what are the infrastructure requirements to really support introduction of AVs in a safe way. The suggestion here is not so much an immediate funding of infrastructure as it is starting with really developing out a more robust strategic plan, thinking forward about what those investments and organizational needs are as we think about infrastructure planning and really focusing around that. So there's a number of states that have gone down this path of developing strategic plans for infrastructure. This is kind of a tried and true approach, if you will, of really identifying what are some of those key need areas. How does an organization, be it WashDOT, be it local agencies, how do they approach kind of establishing priorities for infrastructure investment and begin that process of seeking funds or shifting funding to accomplish those. So another topic as we think about infrastructure is really collaboration and recognizing and understanding that travel, and particularly as we think about some potential early use cases of freight movement around regions, those cross state lines. There's a need to kind of consider what's happening in adjacent states and how states can collaborate with one another, particularly within regions. As it comes to infrastructure and other topics. So one of the recommendations that we're putting forward here is creating a forum of coordination with representatives, certainly in adjacent states like Oregon and Idaho, but even potentially thinking more broadly, what we're calling the WashDOT area. WashDOT is an acronym for the Western Association of Transportation Officials, basically state DOTs in the Western US have kind of a subgroup that they align to. And an example for that that we're citing, the similar group in the Midwest effectively called MASTO has convened a CAV regional strategy and convened a work group across all of these states that's really looking at collaborating and doing a pooled fund approach to certain research topics as well when it comes to automated vehicle adoption. So there's examples in place where this has been done in other regions, really looking at that regional collaboration as well. So equity is certainly a huge part of what needs to be considered as we go forward, and it threads through a number of different topic areas. But as we think about specifically agency readiness, this was an area that we wanted to put in consideration for requiring that consideration of equity be part of any public spending supporting A/B testing and deployment. So we don't have all of the answers, but making sure that any public spending is met with a plan for how equity would be addressed through any testing and deployment is a really important part of that. So the Smart Columbus program is a program of a federally funded program that stood up a few years ago. This was a really important part of that program, an important part of the criteria for moving forward with all of the different use cases, was developing an equity plan and considering how that would be addressed through any of the testing that was done through that program. So partnerships, we've heard a lot today in terms of clearly there's an important need for having that dialogue. I believe Sam mentioned just talking about how important having the conversation is, regardless of the approach a particular state takes, just to having the conversation between the public and private sector, understanding what those needs are and how to keep focused on safety while meeting needs for testing and opportunities for testing as well. So a suggestion here is really creating an office or a position that's focused around developing those private sector partnerships. An example being in Michigan, where there was an office created essentially at the governor's office level that was specifically focused on supporting partnership development and coordinating across state agencies in doing that. So it didn't sit within one specific state agency. It straddled the different agencies to really provide kind of cross-sector support for partnerships and encouraging those investments. All right, so with that, that is the end of our recommendations in the agency readiness category. I want to, and apologies for a little bit cumbersome here as I switch back and forth between screens, but want to open up Mentimeter here to allow an opportunity for input, and we're going to go to we'll go ahead and Mr. Chair, if it's okay, we can open up the mics here for any questions or comments too, but just entering in on the Mentimeter here to any comments that you might want to put in writing with regards to these, and welcome any questions or comments here.
Thank you, Scott. Are there any questions or comments? Doesn't look like it.
Okay, we'll just give a minute here for any feedback. Great, thanks for feedback coming in. Mr. Chair, it looks like Daniela Bremer has a question.
Scott, if you wouldn't mind, you
Yes.
can explain the sort of approach to continue some of the work without the while the work group itself sunsets. Can you kind of explain a little bit what that meant, or how you see that structurally working?
Just sort of a continuation of the work group without the mandate, effectively, is I think that's what you're referring to, Daniela. And so, typically, yes, you need a champion that that really takes the reins of that process. But we've seen that happen in multiple states where it's just an informal convening of different different agencies, within a state or local agencies, different private sector partners. That's essentially, again, just an informal convening of that. It obviously takes a lead. Somebody has to decide it's important and do it, but it doesn't necessarily need a lot of funding so much as, potentially just some staff support to coordinate meetings like this. But effectively, much like the discussions that happen through the current work group process, just kind of continuing that. We've also seen this used very effectively, particularly as we think about federal programs and capturing federal money, federal grants that are available, using that type of forum to really coalesce an approach across partners in proceeding and pursuing after grant opportunities as well. So so again, I think it's not unlike what is happening today, just simply without the exceeding beyond the statutory requirement to do it, just more of voluntary engagement from a lot of the partners that are at the table today, just to continue the dialogue. So appreciate the feedback coming in here. So, I think a comment here, where in the roadmap do we put a set of standards to be met when testing without a human driver? Currently, there are none. This seems irresponsible. So I think this is definitely one of the key challenges that still, needs to be addressed going forward. Essentially a decision around how Washington State wants to approach that question of testing without a human driver. And there are, multiple approaches to do that, as we've talked about, including a number of places that really don't have a specific standard, more of a self-certification model in terms of ability to do that. But explicitly allow that in law with meeting certain requirements. So I think it's really still a discussion around what is the right approach for Washington with regards to that. All right, well, I appreciate the feedback that we're getting in writing and the questions. Let's go ahead and continue down the path here with the next topic. All right, so we're going to move on to testing and pilots. And this is an area that we had a lot of discussion about in developing out a pilot approach that was put forward as a recommendation last year. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. One thing to be clear on here is that we certainly understand there are all kinds of considerations as we think about permitting requirements, specific agency, requirements with regards to this, or what have you, and expect that those are kind of captured in other areas. We're really talking here about kind of what should the focus be if a pilot is approved to create value for the state and the stakeholders here. So just kind of a general note, we understand that a lot of these topic areas are very interconnected with one another. So we need to kind of consider these, very much together as they relate to one another and not fully encompassing within this topic. So we'll talk first about just in general, advancing a pilot. And if you remember, we talked about two different approaches that could really be taken to do this. Or the recommendation that was put forward last year, put forward a single approach, which was this one, to really conduct a state-funded and managed pilot. The idea and the objective being really to create that firsthand experience with AV technology. to recognize that some of the challenges are different and unique to Washington State relative to other pilots that have been done. And also simply that there's no real substitute. Reading a report is not necessarily a substitute for having that experience and going through that experience yourself as an individual, as an agency, to really understand what some of those challenges are. So from an example standpoint, we've talked quite a lot with this group about what Utah DOT did in partnership with the Transit Authority there to develop out a pilot project and really very purposefully engage with a lot of different partners, a lot of different locations, a very, very specific approach to how they tested different use cases, involved different stakeholders and constituencies over that time frame. So the benefit of doing a state-funded and managed pilot, you have full control over what that looks like, and how that's executed and what the objectives are. But we did talk about another approach that we're including in here as well that, again, going forward may have applicability, and that is really a state-led program, but a program that administered more as a grant program or more as a partnership to include other partners to come to the table, perhaps with some of their own funding to execute pilots and manage their own AV projects. So an example of this is Minnesota stood up a program similar to this, what they called the CAV Challenge, which was really an opportunity for kind of a rolling request for funding by different companies, different partners to request funding for different AV testing projects that met some basic objectives of the state, what the state was trying to accomplish with that money. So again, there's multiple ways to encourage and execute pilot activities. So bringing those forward as they may each have different applicability going forward in the future. But critical, whichever approach you take, critical to this and through our discussions with this group, we've heard loud and clear, is that just engagement more broadly is really important to any testing and pilot activities. To be able to communicate what's being done, to be able to expose different constituent groups to that and understand what their needs are in any testing that's going to be happening, particularly as we think about equity and increasing access to different populations as well. And lessons learned is another critical thing. This was something that Utah did very well after they executed their pilot. They had commissioned a lessons learned process through that entire pilot engagement that was doing surveys, documenting findings, more anecdotal type findings, documenting, database findings from survey information that was done, from input from the vehicles, just to really capture a very robust lessons learned to understand how people interacted with this technology and what did the different agencies involved learn from it and need to do in the future to help support this type of pilot testing. All right, so with that, again, I am going to switch screens here and share back to the Mentimeter. And on from this screen to just open that up for conversation here as we think about the testing and pilots pillar. And yeah, happy to do any questions.
Yeah, Scott, Aidan Alley Sullivan here, if I can jump in. You appreciate all of that sort of context around testing. Two things that I just want to be sort of clear as we as a work group are thinking about this. The first piece being that, maybe I'm saying something objectionable here, but all states are not created equal. And so as we're looking at sort of, a Minnesota example, I would argue that Washington is in a much better position to take advantage of autonomous technology than Minnesota would be, based purely on geographic considerations, as well as population considerations, as well as the economic considerations, right? So I think Washington, we as a state have a unique opportunity because of the geographic, economic, population densities that we have in the Seattle region. And so, you know, a testing pilot and outcomes in Minnesota is not going to be the same as outcomes we'll see in Washington. The other thing I want to be clear is that I wouldn't want us, or I don't want us to over-index on pilots as like a next step. From right now, we have testing authority then saying, all right, let's do pilot programs and just do pilot programs in and of themselves. What I mean by that is pilot programs are fine. However, a pilot is not going to advance this technology in Washington without commercial deployment capabilities, right? Companies are going to be reticent to take the initiative and to really do any significant investment and work on setting up a pilot program or a pilot service if there's no opportunity to extend that into theoretically perpetuity, right? And so as we're thinking about pilots, how do we ensure that it actually stimulates the growth? And I think key to that is pilots as part of deployment operations or commercial operability in the state.
Yeah, that's great commenting. Thank you. And I think that, you know, this does get into a little bit, you know, we're going to talk more about path to deployment. I think that touches on some of what you're referring to in terms of that. You know, I think this has been an area of a lot of conversation just in terms of what role does the state have or want to have in really directing a pilot activity, such that some of the objectives, learning objectives of the state, you know, are particularly fulfilled, you know, relative to a private company coming in to really, you know, trial a business model, say, you know, kind of separating those two concepts a little bit in terms of what that learning is. But I get there's a lot of interplay between those two. So I think good comments and discussion there. And thank you for the feedback here on Mentimeter. Any other questions or comments before we move on this one?
Questions or comments?
All right, let's switch back here. I'll probably be pretty good at this by the end of 5 of them. Okay, so we're going to move on to our public outreach topics, and a lot of ground to cover here. This is a really important part, certainly, of what this work group has been doing, and will, I think, be arguably even more important going forward as we think about how to continue to engage the public and different stakeholders. So let's start with public, and you know, we got some really good feedback on this in terms of the objectives here and kind of the role of the state, really on focusing on what the public can expect with this technology, about the you know, the features and limitations of this technology, really a safety focused, you know, orientation for the public. You know, there was a lot of interest in different approaches, a lot of feedback on different approaches and their relative effectiveness. But certainly developing public outreach plans and funding an outreach effort is really going to be the next step there. We all know that's an intensive thing. It's going to take funding. It's going to take the state committing that this is an important need. And that could take a lot of different, look a lot of different ways in terms of being focus groups and public meetings, community events. There's a lot of different ways that you can approach public outreach here, but a plan and funding is really going to be that first step. So an organization called PAVE that's been in front of us before, Partners for Automated Vehicle Education, is an example, you know, of an organization really with that intention in mind of public education in this space. So legislative engagement is going to be critical in addition going forward. And obviously we're fortunate to have legislators with us today and with us in this work group and this executive committee. This process has been very engaged with the legislature. throughout all of the 5 years. As we look forward to sunsetting this group, really how does that kind of continue to go forward with engagement with the legislature is going to be critical here as we kind of think about path forward. So some sort of outreach plan and engagement with the legislature, perhaps a caucus specific with the legislature to continue to have hearings and input on this topic. An example in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin DOT had a CAV strategic plan that had a specific plan, an outreach strategy to the legislature for how to message local government officials and state level officials as well. So really an important focus area going forward. So collaboration, we've again kind of talked about that importance of having the dialogue, continuing that dialogue between state agencies and the industry organizations. Again, multiple work groups that have been just kind of organically stood up to do this. Michigan has one as well that's been in place for a long time. That really looked at cooperatively pursuing projects and creating partnerships amongst the public and private sector in the state. So there's a lot of different examples of that process for exchanging information and building partnerships. Touch again on equity strategy and the importance of having a very specific strategy in terms of equity. As we think about outreach, understanding the needs of kind of diverse community partners and concerns with AVs. So having this really be part of that outreach strategy very specifically. Example in Orlando, where there was a very specific approach to AVs with focus groups for communities with limited English proficiency, with disability communities, older adults, kind of a wide variety of considerations there with regards to equity of this technology. And then finally, pilot engagement. So kind of touching back on this topic that we had talked about previously, that as we think about any state-funded pilot, certainly a huge portion of that should be focused around engagement, around creating opportunities for people to engage and understand this technology. What are the benefits? How do they interact with it? What are the capabilities, et cetera? So again, an example in Minnesota where Minnesota DOT put forward a pilot. It was specifically around engagement, let's say. It was not necessarily a technically challenging pilot. That it aligned with the Super Bowl when it was held there. And it was really specifically about how to engage different communities, bringing different focus groups into the technology to interact with it and get that kind of feedback and input along the way. So a really strong opportunity as part of any state-funded initiatives. All right. I'm going to switch back over to get some feedback on that. You'll bear with me, but welcome any questions on the public outreach pillar.
Questions or comments? Doesn't look like it, Scott.
Okay.
Scott?
Yes.
If I may, sorry, I was just going to echo what you said. I think from an industry perspective, and as far as Waymo is concerned, I think we also recognize that public outreach is definitely key in this. How is it done? I think there's a lot of ways that it could happen, but I think what we realize and what I realize anecdotally, even meeting with members, is there's a lot of questions about the technology. There's a lot of sort of unknowns about the technology, and frankly, a lot of folks don't even know that it's a today technology versus a future technology. And so as much as we are able as an industry to showcase the vehicles to actually take folks for rides, and I think that's something that I've been looking at, as it relates to a lot of states, including Washington, not just Washington, but being able to either bring members to San Francisco or to Phoenix, or to capitalize on other conferences where members or other officials are in Phoenix or San Francisco, and to be able to showcase it, I think is the best work that we can do, better than any pilots, better than any reports, better than any presentations, is actually taking a ride and seeing it. And so I couldn't agree more with you on the public outreach piece of it, especially from a legislative standpoint, legislative and regulatory standpoint. I think it's going to be key for us if we want to see this technology in Washington State.
Great, thank you. Anna?
Yeah, I just still, I guess I may miss something, but I'm confused why we would be spending state funds on public outreach when it seems like much of this is, for the benefit of the companies that want to promote the technology. And at least when I talk to folks that we represent, it seems like, the issues that people are facing around mobility, around housing affordability, around wildfires, like these are things that we need to address and need resources. And people asking for more autonomous vehicles isn't a priority with our community. And, especially just with what we've seen with the cost of ride hail, even if this technology exists, it's unlikely to be affordable to the people we represent. So I really question whether it's a good use of public resources to be, conducting PR for what seem to be private companies at this point.
So let me respond, I guess, on that quickly, and I'll, Aiden, I see your hand going up there. So, to be clear, I think as we've kind of talked about this topic, we've really framed it up as, what is the state's role there? And I absolutely get the sensitivity in terms of what, are we going to spend state money on anything other than, an education campaign that really recognizes these technologies are coming in different ways. So really ensuring that the public understands the technology from a safety standpoint, understands how to interact with the technology, and particularly looking at how the technology could be applied for different communities, for benefit, for equity of access. I think those were really kind of the focus areas. Certainly not, kind of PR or selling products, but really recognizing where the industry is going and what's going to be on the roadway would be the state's role there. So, Aiden, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't think any company has asked or is advocating for state money to do PR for autonomous vehicles. I think if there's an opportunity for the state to educate folks, then that's great. But I do all of my own PR. I do all of my own customer acquisition. I think Sam does as well. Most companies do. So I don't think there's any expectation on the part of industry that the state would be funding any of this type of work for us. I don't think that's what Scott was proposing. I think from an education standpoint, though, there is opportunity for example, I see Bo on the line here as well, for folks at agencies to learn about the technology, to understand how to regulate it, to understand how it operates. And so I think from a public education standpoint, there's opportunity for regulators and practitioners to learn and to understand and to develop processes, et cetera. But I don't think there's an expectation that they would be doing it for teaching someone how to use the Waymo One app on their phone to call a car. We look forward to being able to do all of that on our own, based on our own particulars, and each company would do it in their own unique way.
Thank you, Aiden.
Other questions or comments?
Aiden, you still have your hand? Okay. All right. No, I think we're good.
All right. Very good. And thank you for the great feedback via Mentimeter. Appreciate that. Really helpful to capture a lot of thoughts there. Okay, so now we're going to move on to safety, and we've got kind of a number of topics to go through here. And again, you're starting to see things that kind of intertwine between topic areas. We're going to develop kind of an approach that really shows how interrelated some of these things are as we get into the written document, just to acknowledge some of the connectivity between topics here. So as we get into safety, let's talk about law enforcement and first responders. And this has been something that's been broadly acknowledged as a really important area of focus and a need as we see more and more kind of pilots or deployment on roadways. So the recommendation here of requiring a law enforcement or first responder interaction guide that is either engaging kind of each of those deployment jurisdictions or is somehow a state level guide still to be determined. But bottom line, the importance of developing that interaction plan to require that. And this is something that's been done by a number of other states and agencies in doing that, often kind of a tabletop exercise of sitting around the table, going through with the different stakeholders to really understand and work through different potential scenarios for interaction, so that all parties kind of understand what that looks like and how to interact with these vehicles. So incident reporting and analysis, again, this is an area where it differs kind of state to state in other states that have put into effect policies around AV use as to whether there's a requirement for this. But it is something to put on the table that Washington State may still want to consider. What is the role the state wants to take in this? There's a certain amount of reporting that is that's currently required, and certainly examples such as California that we've talked about previously, where there's reporting requirements for any kind of or for not any kind, but for incidents of a certain level that have property damage or bodily injury or death. So multiple ways that this could be handled, but just addressing the desire to have this data as part of the recommendation going forward. So incident reporting, specific as we think about liability and really developing out kind of scenarios as we think about this, kind of the state's tolerance for risk and different AV deployment scenarios. Sorry, I'm moving my camera or moving my window around the screen here as I was missing the lead into this. So,
we do have a quick question though from Representative Kloba.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thanks. I think it was the previous slide where you were talking about the incident reporting and having, coming up with some sort of reporting framework. And how are you envisioning that to be different than our current incident reporting requirements, whereby companies who are testing in the state have to every year report any moving violation or crash incident that they have had?
Yeah.
What are you, are we kind of developing, building on that?
So I think that's really Representative Kloba. I think that's the kind of the question on the table is that, as we think about going forward, path forward, is that process working? Is it is the staff time there to be able to process that information? Is there a need to tweak that process going forward or further resource it to be effective going forward? So it's not so much a recommendation to change it so much as it is an acknowledgement that it's a process in place today that the state may need to continue to kind of consider. How might that change over time? Are there changes needed to make it kind of effective in its intention?
All right, thank you.
So getting back to this topic here is really again kind of thinking about incident reporting and analysis, but thinking about it in terms of different AV deployment scenarios and essentially risk tolerance around that. So as we think about could be very low speed operations, could be very isolated operations to particular geographic area versus higher speed or wide open types of operations on the roadways. The state effectively thinking about each of those but with a different lens to the risk tolerance and what type of information might be needed to ensure safety or understand the impacts of those different types of testing operations in the state. So this is something that NHTSA has started to do at the national level in thinking about those kind of different test cases and scenarios from a liability standpoint. So thinking about vulnerable road users, pedestrians, bicyclists, what have you, we've kind of talked about a lot of the outreach piece of this. Obviously, just a really important understanding of safety and understanding how to interact with these vehicles. Outreach is certainly clearly a very important part of that. But also thinking about as we think about any types of fixed operations or any critical areas, you think about different pilots or testing activities, looking at even road signs and guidance. So some examples here from Utah and the pilot that we talked about earlier, just getting people oriented to this technology in places that it may be operating in kind of a fixed operation today or in the future. Really just helpful to kind of begin that orientation process, improve the familiarity as we think about vulnerable road users interacting with it. So infrastructure, again, we've kind of talked about infrastructure previously here and the potential role of it with regards to safety. We talked about kind of developing a strategic plan for infrastructure investments. Really, again, just acknowledging here the likely importance as we think about further deployment of AVs and things such as pavement marking, improved pavement markings. Some of the obvious areas that we've talked about for years as being really important and valuable to safe AV operation. But also thinking about things like managing curb space and whatnot, more future focused concepts as we see more and more use of ride hailing type services and what have you. And data and cybersecurity. So, a little bit more on the security than the safety side, but certainly a safety element to this as well. Really supporting initiatives that are focused on that data management and data security is a critically important part of the equation as well. And doing that in a way that really is aligned with national efforts as well is an important part of that scenario going forward. So let's switch back over to get some feedback on the topics related to safety, and again, open it to any questions.
Yes, Aiden.
Yeah, again, a couple thoughts, and Scott, you had a bunch of slides. Actually, if let's see, the first one on law enforcement interaction, agree with you that there should be some type of a methodology or process for companies to engage. One thing that I would, again, highlight regarding what that would look like, having a statewide law enforcement plan that is provided to state officials, I think is the most appropriate manner to handle this. It should be handled at the state level. Having to have individual law enforcement plans for each and every city, each and every jurisdiction, neighborhood, et cetera, would be, untenable and also wouldn't really make much sense. I think you want the same standard safety expectations in Seattle as you would in Bellevue. I don't think there's any distinction or difference between safety as it comes to particular cities or regions. So having that standard, obviously each company is going to produce it differently, just like each car manual is different. The Toyota manual looks different than a BMW manual, but at the end of the day, they all say how to put gas and what, the tires should be pumped up to. So having some type of a mandate from the state as to what that law enforcement plan should include. Makes sense. Here are the expectations. Present it to me however you'd like, but here's what the information that I'm looking for from you, company. I think is appropriate, expected. It's something that has sort of become an industry norm and standard. Let's see, after law enforcement interaction, what was your second slide on this topic? It was on
incident reporting.
Incident reporting, yeah, that's right. Again, full expectation. I think, you know, Sam would probably agree that any type of reports, we're already reporting them at the federal level. So, you know, would not be unnecessarily burdened to report them at the state level. I think as we're looking at what that process can and should look like, there's certainly opportunities to streamline, right? Right now in California, I do the same form, an NHTSA form and a OL 316 for California DMV. It's fine. It's not a big deal, but it's the same information going to two jurisdictions. And so is there an opportunity to streamline that? Perhaps there is, and that might be something that over time and as this gets more federal oversight, there's a more robust or more standardized process to report incidents. Ideally, I think we will get to a point. Right now, you don't report every accident you have with a human-driven car in a state because it just, if an accident happens, it's an accident. And so I would anticipate that at some point in the future, this type of reporting would not be necessary. But until that time, having as much standardization as we can have would be helpful for companies, but also would be helpful from a data analysis standpoint. Like for like, having the same sort of reporting throughout California and Washington would allow for probably some interesting data crunching to to look at trends, et cetera, versus having a distinct form for each area that you're operating. So that's another thing that I would just sort of think about on the reporting side.
Thank you, Aiden. Scott, can you scroll down so we can see all of the?
You bet. I love having to scroll down. Thanks for the input, everybody. Appreciate that. Right.
Looks like Dave has his hand up too.
Sure. Yeah, I would echo Aiden's point about standardization of the data collection and incident reporting, and what Anna said here in the comments too. We got to make sure that when the data is being collected, it's being collected for the purposes of safety, right? It's not about collecting certain metrics and doing so for improving the vehicles. NHTSA is collecting, as you said, Scott, some of that information to do kind of vehicle safety work, to do certain things about rulemaking for safety. So we want to make sure that this is focused on incident reporting in the vein of collecting information that's important for you for the safety of the kind of operations, as Representative Klobah said at the beginning, right? That's what we are collecting, and that's what we should continue to collect in that regard.
Scott, one other thing I'll add, I know one of your slides on the infrastructure talked about sort of being intentional about planning as we're looking at redoing and upgrading infrastructure, for example, striping, right? I think that's a great point. What I will say is that I don't need any sensors or anything special put in the roadway. What I need is the same thing that humans need: good pavement, clear signage, good lane striping, that type of thing. But being sort of intentional about that as we're thinking about these technologies and as we're thinking about infrastructure in the state. Great call out, and I'd love to to continue to see that. I think that's an important one to note.
Great, thank you for that. All right, I am going to switch back over here. Finish our last topic in a shocking turn of events. We are exactly on the time frame we had laid out, so thank you for bearing with us. We knew this would take a bit, but this is the culmination of a lot of work and effort from this group. So really appreciate you kind of staying with us and providing thoughts and feedback here. So we're going to kick into our last topic area, path to deployment. As I'm sure you can figure out by now, after going through 4 of these topic areas, there are a lot of threads in here already that really lead to a path to deployment. So, some critical things with regards to agency readiness, with regards to safety, outreach and how people interact. Let's talk about some additional topics here. to conclude our path forward. Really here, I think, one of the key activities that needs to happen as we think about path to deployment, we've touched on it already, is that engagement with industry. So really getting clear expectations around what the regulatory agencies need, supporting entities, what the companies need to really gain that kind of clear path to deployment and put together those steps forward. So, this is something, Texas, as an example, has done some research on different on path to deployment that have really kind of focused around this kind of concept of revolutionary versus evolutionary, path to deployment, and what that looks like, what that should look like for the state of Texas. I think, similarly, Washington, I think this group has been sort of considering that concept along the way. I think continuing to kind of evaluate what is the right path forward for Washington, and what does that look like is going to be really important going forward. Also, thinking about this again from a national level, and we've heard some comments here on the importance of kind of harmonizing with what is happening nationally, taking advantage of some of that is a really important part of path to deployment overall. So thinking about working towards a national framework, engaging with other states around that. So an example is work zone data exchange is something that is really being kind of championed at the national level. How do we develop data sets and exchange that in a common format that can be used by vehicle operators kind of regardless of jurisdiction that they are operating in? As a great example of some of the areas where Washington really is going to need to partner to be able to continue to advance towards a path to deployment. So regulatory structure and laws, simply put, there are definitely updates to licensing as an example that are going to be needed. And I know I saw some comments earlier kind of in regards to this and kind of how we think about the computer operator, as analogous to the human operator, and as we think about ticketing, that's an example of something as we kind of think about licensing and clarifying the need for the role of a human operator, conducting education around that to drivers. So I think there's a number of topics here that really still need to be addressed through updates to licensing, to vehicle code, what have you, to kind of address this part of deployment. So data privacy is another element of that, and certainly recognizing kind of changes and increases in data that potentially come from these vehicles be collected by the state, putting some boundaries around that and some guardrails around that. Virginia is a good example of a state that's kind of gotten out front on this in thinking about data privacy and data access for data that the state is receiving around these vehicles. So I think there were comments about this earlier, really kind of thinking about when it was essentially a local preemption comment, but kind of bringing this back to how do we think about permitting, how do we think about allowing vehicle operations in a streamlined way, acknowledging that there could be multiple levels to it today, and recognizing the potential that there could be more streamlined approaches that still reach the same outcome in terms of safe operation, in terms of putting safety requirements around these services. So as an example, in Columbus, as part of the Smart Columbus program, there was very much a trial and error process around what types of approvals were actually needed until it was recognized that there was essentially an approval at the state level that would kind of simplify that process that already legally superseded that of the city, but is effectively provided for the same outcome at the end of the day. So really understanding and working through some of those requirements is going to be critical as we think about more wide-scale deployment as well. And finally, we're going to touch on workforce. And, this is something that, again, this is, a topic that's being covered, being researched from a lot of different corners of the country and different industries and what have you. There's a lot of research out there on workforce impact of AVs. But clearly there is a state level look at this that needs to recognize the very specific workforce of Washington State, kind of the unique attributes of that and what those likely shifts will have to look like in Washington. Again, just kind of putting forward here the concept of really tying into research activities that are being done at the national level, but continuing to push on that more at the Washington State level, recognizing kind of the unique attributes of the workforce in the state. All right, we have made it, and I'm going to switch back one more time here for feedback. And again, open the floor for questions on or comments, input on path to deployment.
Questions or comments? Yes, David.
Scott, yeah, thanks, Jim. I'll just jump in here too. Thanks again for all of this, Scott. I think it's a really good context, and I think the examples are really helpful. I would just note in the privacy context, and the example uses Virginia. I think that's really apt. I would note that the privacy law was done in a broader sort of context, right? More than just in the automotive, more than just in the AV context. And I think that's something that the state should be mindful of, right? That this law is more broad than just being done in AVs, and that there are consequences to that. And that should be kind of the kind of approach in any state. You just have to be careful about the privacy considerations given the broader implications.
Great, thanks for that feedback.
Thank you, David. Brenda.
Yeah, I just wanted to flag, particularly given the last slide on workforce, that our workforce committee has worked with some folks at WSU, and for the final report, we should have some information that really directs to some of that research that Scott was talking about. And that, we're excited to do some stakeholder conversations around that as we head into the final stretch before our last meeting.
Great. Thanks for that, Brenda. We'll be sure to flag that. Appreciate it.
Other questions or comments? Brenda, you still have your hand up?
Yep, I'll lower it.
Thank you. Oh.
Yeah, I just think the path to deployment is one of the most, I think, important conversations. I think that it seems like we as a state need to have, and I know there has been some legislative activity around this, and I was just curious to hear if Aiden, if your folks or others or other folks from this are thinking of running a bill again for 2024. I do think to the extent that if that is true, if we can have that discussion nice and early and sort of see where folks are at, I think it might just help with that conversation if there are plans. And I know we've had a number of conversations about they want that pathway to commercialization, which is understandable. But I was just curious if there are any plans in that space, or if folks are comfortable talking about that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I mean, how would I phrase it? I think and I'm speaking for myself here. I don't want to speak for industry. I would love to see a path to commercial deployment in Washington. I used to live in Seattle, so I feel a sense of kinship to the state, if I may. I think it's a unique opportunity, and I'd love to be able to see our technology operating there. With that said, there's only so much that, industry in and of ourselves can do. I think we really need to see partnership, and I'd love to see that indeed, like the technology is wanted, that folks want to see, that folks want to see the growth, and they want to see this technology coming to Washington and see that partnership. I don't want to be in a situation where we introduce a bill and we're just fighting tooth and nail to get something. The reality is that there's a ton of other states, and I mean this with as much respect as possible, but there's a lot of other states that are begging us to come, to develop our technology there. And so all else being equal, companies are going to choose the path of least resistance. That's just how business works. And we're going to, grow and expand in jurisdictions that really want us. And so that's why I say, I think there's unique opportunity in Washington. We've run bills in the past. I know that, Bo, you've been a great supporter of us as we've worked to try and advance this technology, and we appreciate it. I would love to see this work group say, look, one of the outcomes from, the last couple of years of our efforts and our discussions and our robust debate that we've had is that we agree that the path forward for the state is legislation that would allow for commercial operations. And if we as a work group could support something of that sort, I think there'd be great opportunity from industry standpoint to really rally behind and bring our resources to bear to support that. But again, if we face opposition, if we're not getting that sort of broader support, and if we don't think there's a path forward, then we're probably not going to pursue that legislatively.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. That's super helpful. Interesting to just kind of read some of the comments about, what does path to deployment mean? Because at least for me, I think it feels pretty clear in my mind, where we do a lot of the testing, but we don't, I was down in Phoenix for a conference. I rode the Waymo one. I got to do a ride along with Cruise. It was just interesting to see it commercially working, in those areas. And so in my mind, it's pretty clear what they're not able to do. And, you're able to go visit jurisdictions where they are doing it. So I'd love to hear from others, though, just kind of how they're thinking about path to deployment. Because at least for me, always in this space, it's been one of the biggest questions. I know we talk about, well, are you going to need a driver license in the future? And at least as I'm seeing the technology develop, the situation where you're going to go out and buy a level 5 AV as a private citizen is not really that much on the horizon. It seems like more of this, and Aid, maybe you can speak to this model of, offering sort of that ride hailing service. That's what at least, we've been observing. And, certainly there's a number of cars that have features, but ultimately the driver is still in control and responsible. And so anyway, I'm probably rambling here, but yeah, we'd just love to just kind of, Aiden, you have thoughts on that, but generally just if folks have thoughts on the path to deployment, hopefully you can all speak up and we can, hear where you're at on it too.
Well, and one other thing I'll say here, Bo, regarding sort of deployment, there's opportunity. I know there's been a lot of questions in, Scott, you raised the issue around sort of workforce. And so as we think about development, what are ways that we can sort of mitigate some of those workforce questions, or how do we manage that with regard to what we're allowing to operate? And so I think there's ways to sort of manage that workforce question as well as allowing for deployment operations. Our model, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we had done a lot of work on the trucking side of the space. We're now focused primarily on the rideshare service. Sam, I think I don't want to speak for your company, but I believe you guys are focused mainly on rideshare as well. And so there's unique ways to look at deployment. Are you going to allow for deployment of human-driven cars? Would you allow for deployment of passengerless AVs? Would you allow for deployment of trucks and cars, right? I think there's a lot of sort of different unique business models in the space that folks are operating. And so, that's also something to think about as well as we look at deployment operations.
Thank you, Aiden. Thank you, Bo, for the question. Brenda.
Yeah, I would just follow up on the discussion that Bo raised around stakeholder engagement on a bill. I mean, as most of us know, there was a bill that is introduced. It's a short session, so it's still introduced and could be revived. But there has not been a convening of the stakeholders that participated in that legislative session. So, I know there's still time, it's September, but those of us in Washington that are working on kind of these cutting edge policies like to gather and have time to talk about it. You don't have to be from Seattle to like process. So it would be interesting to see what we're going to do in that space of convening stakeholders around the bill and legislative agendas and moving forward. And I don't know if you or Sam or others have comments on that beyond what you've already said, but I just wanted to, put a spotlight on that.
No, and so I would, are you sort of alluding that there hasn't been stakeholder engagement?
Correct.
So, and then I'd have to respectfully push back on that. And I think Brent is also on the line here as well. While we might have started that process, a little bit late, there's been extensive stakeholder outreach. We've had so many calls. David, I mean, you know how many calls Avia has convened with anyone and everyone who wanted to have a discussion on that topic. So there's been a significant amount of stakeholder outreach. I'm not saying we won't continue to do that. We'd love to continue to do that. And I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone at any time. But again, I'd have to push back on that because I was on dozens and dozens of calls at the beginning of the session as we were working through this process. And frankly, at the very last second, certain parties came out opposed to the bill, having never had any discussion with industry, having never engaged in this process. And it was a bit disingenuous, I think, on their part to come out in opposition in the form and manner that they did. So there's been a lot of discussion. And, Brent, I know you've had tons of calls. You've discussed with folks on the ground in the Capitol with members. I've met with members. I brought my car up to the Capitol to do physical displays. We've hosted folks in Bellevue when we were doing our rain testing. So, I mean, I'm open to anything, but I'd also argue that I've done a ton in trying to push this legislatively forward from an outreach perspective.
I hear you, Aiden. I actually had a conversation with Brent last year. I might be one of those disingenuous people that you're speaking about because we did come out in opposition to that as the union that drives trucks and people around, but we still haven't received a call from industry or from anyone, frankly, to discuss what those workforce impacts would be and what your legislation could look like and how we could partner or how we could be a part of those conversations. Not been a part of a single call or have not received a single email.
Jim, it seems like we lost your audio.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have Armand Shabazian. I'm hoping I get your name right. I've given you permission to talk, so please ask your question. And then Bo, you're next.
Thank you, Chair. This is Armand Shabazian from the Seattle Department of Transportation. I just wanted to echo, excuse me, Brenda's comment that we have been really proactive in outreach to the industry, including outreach to Waymo staff and the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, but we did not see that level of proactive engagement from the industry or the industry representation during the past legislative session when the bill was introduced. So I just want to echo that we are really open to coordinating and staying in contact, recognizing that autonomous vehicles are going to arrive in cities. And so we hope that there's a higher level of engagement with us as we enter into the next session, because again, to echo Brenda's point, we didn't see that in the past session.
Thank you, Armand. I appreciate that. And to make a statement, just so people understand, until this work group sunsets, any legislation that deals with autonomous vehicles needs to come through this work group and be vetted through the Transportation Commission and then sent to the legislature. That's in the law.
So just to be clear there, Jim, you're saying that any piece of legislation that deals with autonomous technologies has to go through this work group first? A legislator can't just introduce a bill that of their own volition?
A legislator can definitely introduce a bill. The legislature is in control of that, so that we can't stop them from doing that. Right. However, the legislature passed the law that created this work group and said that all autonomous vehicle legislation would come through this work group and then be presented to the Washington State Transportation Commission and then forwarded to the legislature with recommendations. Okay, Bo.
Well, yeah, and I guess I just, I didn't sort of bring it up just to stir up trouble, but I do think it's helpful for us all to sort of get on the same page, right? And because I think, Aiden, you bring up good points about you're not going to go to states where you don't feel like it's an environment that you want to be in, right? I mean, I hear you. And thank you for saying that and being honest, because that's like, why are we meeting if not to have honest conversations, right? And that's why it's nice to have, Brenda here and Armand here. I mean, that's why else do we meet? And so I just think it's good if we can just try to get on the same page. Like, are we serious about the path to deployment? Do we think there's space for us as industry and regulators and others, stakeholders to come together or not? And I just, that's why I bring it up. So like I said, hopefully, it's not to kick the hornet's nest here. I just think we're all here. Let's discuss stuff, right?
Good points, Bo. Good points. Representative Kloba.
Yeah, thanks for calling on me. I understand and appreciate the role that this group needs to play, as well as the Transportation Commission in terms of vetting bills. And that has been, easy enough to do previously, but as we are in the run up to the kind of end of this group, that becomes a tricky timeline, given that like our staff who help us draw bills, the Office of what is OPR, whatever, our office staff, is not around basically during September, and then doing all kinds of stakeholdering and et cetera. That can be challenging. I'm wondering if we have, if we could have maybe some guidelines in terms of if, say, for instance, the next meeting of this group, what would be the deadline to get the information in so that it's on the agenda so that we can have that conversation. And then the same thing goes for the Transportation Commission, because I know it's not just a matter of showing up at the meeting. There's, you have to engage prior to that so that you can get the materials appropriate to the discussion supplied to the folks who are going to have that discussion. So maybe that's an offline conversation, or maybe you send that to all of us legislators who are on the work group, so that we have that timeline, so that we can understand how to get more voices giving us feedback on the potential bills.
Thank you, Representative Kloba. I appreciate your comments. Yeah, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly. As we get closer and closer to sunset, there are going to be things that were put in the law that created this group that are going to have an effect on being able to get legislation put through. And it's one of the reasons why when we created this commission or this work group, we chose 4 members of the House, 4 members of the Senate, both parties represented equally. So that we could get that feedback and that we could get that idea of what the legislature really wants to do here. I would love to see the work group continue, because I think we're doing good work and there's still more work to be done. However, with us sunsetting, then we need to have some kind of way to continue these conversations and discussion. And the commission is in support of that. The chair and I have spoken, and the executive director and I have spoken, and we would continue conversations with the legislature on that. However, we do need some guidance from the legislature itself. So thank you for that comment. Other questions or comments?
Mr. Chair, if I could, before we start to lose people here at the top of the hour, I want to make sure to move on. Again, really appreciate all the feedback and comments through this process, throughout the last year and a half, focused on the roadmap. Throughout the last 5 years, certainly today, the feedback on the roadmap has been great. I do want to put forward, we had kind of indicated previously, the intention here is that we're going to take this feedback to and address it within the roadmap to start to develop out the document with the expectation of a voting action on this at our October meeting. And the intention to move it forward as a recommendation that the roadmap be adopted as kind of the go forward guide for the state coming out of the work group. So we wanted to take a minute here today to just, now we've kind of gotten this feedback again through Mentimeter, if you would, just to take the executive committee's pulse on, based on what you've seen, the discussion that we've had today, do you feel that you could support a recommendation around advancing the roadmap come October? And if the answer is no, or maybe we're going to ask for a little bit more there, but we want to make sure that we are in a position here that this group broadly feels that the roadmap kind of characterizes the important items going forward from this group at its sunset. So we'll just give a minute for this feedback here. We'll just try to get up to the critical mass on voting here, and then we'll advance this one more to get some feedback for those that voted no or are not sure. Kind of what are some of the concern areas that may hold you back from that? So I guess while we wait for some more votes, I think, Mr. Chair, if we want to open up, if anybody wants to come on mic to discuss, what concerns they may have in supporting it, we'll allow a chance for doing that in writing here. But
Thank you, Scott. Well, if you voted not sure or voted no, we'd love to hear from you as to what your concerns are regarding supporting the recommendation to adopt the roadmap. Yes, Brenda.
I don't have a lot of reservations about the roadmap, but I think the question that you asked at the end is, what role does this work group or the commission play moving forward, is the question that remains unanswered for me. And so that makes it difficult to say, yep, this is the final word, if we don't know, really what the next steps are, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense, Brenda, and I appreciate your comment. Anna.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you've heard me share this before, but I just, for me, it's a question of resources and where we should be investing as a state, our energy, our staff capacity. And, this seems like a situation where there's going to be a lot of other states running pilots, investing in this. Does Washington State need to be one of them? I don't see a compelling reason why.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate your comment. Other questions are, actually, we looks like we have responses in the Mentimeter. So if you've answered no or not sure, please share your thoughts with us. Aiden, yes.
Yeah, thanks. And Scott, directionally, I think this makes a lot of sense. Now, granted, it's very hard to be able to support this pathway forward without seeing something beyond, these few slides and really knowing what that looks like, seeing something in writing. In regards to, the legislation we introduced, the only reason that we introduced that bill is because Seattle, and Armand, I know you're on here and you'll acknowledge this because I know your team has acknowledged this. The only reason we introduced that bill is because Seattle introduced legislation at the city level with zero input from any industry, including us, participants. And so we were forced to introduce legislation that would allow for statewide operations. And so, I just want to be clear on where this is coming from. We're the only company that's, and folks that have put something forward. Now, if there's a proposal, I'd be happy to see someone's proposal as to what that pathway to deployment looks like. But I mean, at a certain point, we as a group have to make that decision. Do we want to support the growth of the technology or not, right? Like, what does Washington want? And if we want that, then let's move forward on that. If we don't want it, then that's great. As I mentioned, and as Bo noted, like, companies will say, when Washington's ready, we'll circle back. But if you guys aren't ready right now, that's fine, and we'll continue to look at other places. But again, I just want to be clear, and to say that Waymo hasn't engaged with Seattle, again, I'll use the word, is a bit disingenuous, because Seattle didn't engage with us. And when they introduced their legislation, we were banging our heads against the wall to get information and to understand what was going on at the city level. So, it's easy to say that Waymo is not talking to you, but, let's be clear here. Seattle has also played this game. And I'm getting a little, I hope everyone can appreciate that this is a work group, and we're having robust discussions. It's not meant to target anyone, and I hope you guys realize that, but some of these things just need to be said in the safe environment.
No, that's okay, Aiden. It's not a problem. We understand completely. And, and although I appreciate Seattle's input and things of that nature, they joined this work group so that they could represent all cities. So I truly would like to hear their input on what the rest of the cities in the state are concerned about when it comes to autonomous vehicles, not just Seattle. So I understand your concerns, Aiden. Other questions or comments? So Rima posted in here, I'm not sure if you've all seen it, but it says, absent legislative direction, we have to assume this work group is sunsetting in December, and thus will craft the roadmap under this assumption. It will be important to ensure the roadmap report is relevant regardless. So if the 2024 legislature provides direction for carry-on work, the roadmap will still be relevant input to the lawmakers. Good point, Rima.
All right. Well, I think we've gotten some feedback here. Really helpful again.
I've got Brenda's hand up, Scott. Go ahead, Brenda.
Yeah, just really quickly, I'm curious how the comments that we left in Mentimeter will be incorporated into the recommendations, because there were a lot of concrete recommendations that I read in the Mentimeter report that may or may not have had the vetting that some of the other subcommittees have done, but still seem important nevertheless. So just curious how that will be handled before we meet again.
I'll let Scott weigh in on that. And then Armand, I see your hands up, so we'll call you next.
Yeah, so again, just a reminder here. So obviously we've gotten the feedback from Mentimeter today. We're going to take that and go back and look at what we've put together to understand how to address as many of those comments as we can. Obviously there's going to be some areas of conflict between comments, that we're trying to balance kind of the overall perspective of this work group and recognize that there are some unanswered questions here, that it's important to bring forward the question that still has to be addressed, not just all the answers going forward with this as well. I want to reiterate that we are opening this for feedback. The materials for the meeting, including those slides, have been published and put out. You should have gotten an email about that yesterday. We're happy to accept, any review that you want to take in the next week. Happy to accept comments back, directly from you on that. If you want to take a look at, any of the recommendations that came forward there and provide back your feedback, would be happy to take that as well.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. As they say in the legislature, members will have 5 days to change their comments or, make changes to their comments. So gotcha. Understood. Other questions, comments on this item? Okay, Armand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond really quickly to some of the comments that Aiden made. So in Seattle, we did not introduce legislation. We used an existing process through our street use public space management program to manage a private use of the right of way, which is autonomous vehicle testing. We did do outreach to the industry through the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, through which Waymo is a member. And we are really pleased to announce that we have permitted all companies with active testing in Washington State, which includes Zoox and NVIDIA. I want to also make clear that we worked with the city of Bellevue to release a strategic vision for automated vehicles earlier this year. And we are really excited to continue dialogue with the industry on what deployment will look like in our cities. I also want to commend Waymo for being a member of the Open Mobility Foundation, which maintains the mobility data specification. We are really pleased to see that Waymo has been engaged in that. Leave with that and note that the reason we have our street use permit for AV testing is we wanted to supplement rather some of the requirements we saw at the state level that we felt could use additional bolstering, specifically around insurance, indemnification, and test driver. So we are really interested to see how the deployment conversation will continue, and we also really hope that the industry continues to work with us as deployment becomes imminent, especially since Seattle has a really robust history of managing mobility in the right of way, especially through our management of other shared mobility like electric scooters and bikes. So I'll just leave the conversation open that we're really interested to see how this will develop. And we want to make sure too that we are all collaboratively thinking about what happens post-deployment when the devices, or in this case vehicles, are actually on our streets, to make sure that we're providing transportation to the folks that need it most. We're getting the data we need to tell the story about how this is helping target populations, so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for your comments, Armand. Other questions or comments? Anything for the good of the order from the exec committee? Any member want to introduce something, or talk about something that didn't get discussed today? Now is your time.
Mr. Chair, if I could, before we break here, I just one point of clarification that I wanted to make, and apologies, Representative Klobo, I'll be quick here. But just in terms of next steps, so we talked about the feedback that we're going to take in and allow comments over the next week. Our intention is then to take that feedback, develop this out into that full written report, and provide that to this group in advance of the October work group meeting. So the intention that we're taking the time to get that final document out, hear the comments on words matter, and we certainly respect and understand that, and are going to push this out and provide that opportunity for review before we get to that October meeting as well. So just wanted to make that clear. More information to come on the exact schedule of that, but I just wanted to make clear what that looks like in advance of October.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. Representative Kloba.
Great. And yeah, thanks, Scott, for mentioning that. I just wanted to throw out there that the liability question is one that's very compelling to me, and I'm just in the beginning stages of putting together legislation around that. I think it will clarify things, and I look forward to any input that anyone wants to share with me on that.
Thank you so much, Representative Kloba. Other questions or comments? Okay. Go ahead and do the closing remarks, recap for today's meeting, action items, agreements, and decisions. Scott?
Yeah, again, I think we really appreciate the feedback today. This was, this was really a working meeting of the work group, to be sure to get the feedback on the roadmap. Again, just looking ahead to October 4th, that is really our intention of then taking a voting action on the roadmap as a recommendation forward from this group. So, again, more to come on the exact schedule between now and then, but that's, that's essentially the timeline that we're looking at, and the action that we're looking at in October. So, so please make yourself available. This will really be the, an important meeting, and in terms of voicing, we hope that support to push the roadmap forward. Excuse me.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Okay, anything else for the good of the order? One more time. Hearing none. Important dates to remember, October 4th, the AV Work Group meeting, voting action. December 31st is the final AV Work Group report due to the governor and the legislature. I know of no other business to come before the committee and would adjourn the meeting if there's no objection. Hearing, seeing no objection, so ordered. We are adjourned as of 12:10 p.m. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today.
Thank you all.